Of the believers here in Saugus, we welcome each of you to this weekend and to this first meeting. We're grateful you've come. And for the speakers, I can say we're very grateful we were asked to come and are delighted to be here. Let me just lay out the day and the weekend for you. Today, starting at 10 a.m., which was 15 minutes ago, we began our first meeting. This meeting will go on for 2.5 hours, which sounds like an awfully long stretch. But 15 minutes are already over of that 2.5 hours, so that's one good thing. Another is that we will have 2 breaks, a brief one when I'm finished speaking here, and then we'll divide the remaining time up into 2, and we'll give you a generous maybe 10 or even 11 minutes of break so that you can stretch and leave the auditorium and come back refreshed. This meeting then will go on until 12:30. We'll have a buffet lunch in between. That's perhaps a very dismissive way of talking of some very good food I know they have prepared for us, but anyway, that's how it will be served. And then at 2 o'clock, we'll have the next meeting. And if that's what you realize right now, that's enough. You don't need to know any more than that. At 2 o'clock, we'll tell you what happens later, although I can give you a sneak preview that there will be a gospel meeting at 4:45. Now, the purpose of this morning's talk, if I can call it that, is to kind of lay the foundation for the weekend. And we have chosen 3 topics that we would call Christian apologetics. Apologetics is one of those Janus words, we call them, which means one thing and it means the opposite at the same time. Okay? It's like a cleaving in the Bible. Does cleave mean to split wood in 2, or does it mean to join together? Well, the answer is it means both, and you have to decide which one in context. So, apology, normally we think of that as saying, I'm sorry, I offended you, I did something wrong, I'm embarrassed, this is something that should never have come about, and therefore I apologize to you. I'm sorry. If you want, I'll grovel in the dirt before you and do some penance. I'm just trying to create the ambiance of that word. That's very much the opposite of what we're talking about today. To give an answer, apologia in Greek, an answer, is to give a reasoned argument to defend a position that you believe. Not because you're embarrassed of it, because you firmly are committed to it. And you have someone who is objected to it, and you have an answer for them in order that you might persuade them to leave their former position and to adopt yours. That's what we mean by apologetics. Now, the role of apologetics in evangelism, the role of apologetics for Christians, is something I'm going to ask you to put on the back burner, because I really like to spend a little bit of time tomorrow afternoon as we kind of bring all the threads together, and I'd like to explain how that can be helpful and its limitations as well. But let me say up front that to me, the value of apologetics has more to do with Christians than it does with non-Christians. Now, there is a sense in which many people are seeking truth, and the Spirit of God is working in their lives, but they have some intellectual objection to the Christian faith. And if you can clear away those objections for them and get them to see that what you believe is rational and comports with history, then they may be able to move forward and accept their responsibility before God and to repent and to believe the gospel. That is true. At the same time, no matter how many clever arguments you have and how persuasive your style, if you're dealing with an unregenerate person who does not seek God, who is not under conviction of sin, no amount of your arguing will ever convince that person to be a Christian. So you're wasting your time. That person does not have an intellectual deficit. He or she has a moral and spiritual deficit. And the reason he won't accept your arguments is not because they're not plausible, but because they require him to submit to an all-powerful God who holds him accountable for his sins and to whom he must answer after his life is over. And he's not willing to accept those things. He will live in giant denial, and therefore he will deny your claims and your arguments. But to a Christian who already believes, and of course every true believer is a believer from the time of salvation to the end of his life and on into eternity and forever. But there's such a thing as greater faith and lesser faith. There's such a thing as weak faith and even sick faith. And on the other hand, there's such a thing as strengthened and thriving and vibrant faith. And we want that kind of faith. And that kind of faith comes from the Word of God. It also comes from looking at things that show us the wonders of that word and its truth and its way of explaining reality, its way of addressing all of our great big questions like where did we come from and is there meaning in our lives and to whom are we responsible and where are we going? These things, once they're answered satisfactorily, are wonderfully upbuilding for our faith. So really, the fact that this room isn't full of unbelievers and skeptics is not a problem for us speakers, because we're really here to speak to you and to ourselves and to give an intellectual, yes, but maybe more importantly, a biblical and spiritual basis for what we believe. So I've taken the topic of the Bible and science, and I'll defend why I have done that in a moment. And then we'll move on to talk about the Word of God itself and its veracity, we say, its truthfulness, its claims, its infallibility, its inerrancy. And we'll talk about what all those terms mean. Andrew's responsible for that this afternoon. And then tomorrow, David is going to take up the person of Christ and the nature of the atonement. And if we walk away with a firmer understanding of those things, we'll be in very good shape. And the Spirit of God can use this truth, I know, in our lives. Now, the reason I've decided to take up the Bible and science is because I think this is the area where Christians feel the most threatened and embarrassed in public education, higher education, and even in the workplace. You can believe many things and still be held as a reasonably intelligent, with-it person. But if people discover you're a young earth creationist, you will be laughed off the stage. And out of a sense of deep embarrassment that this is such an anti-intellectual position because of the snow job that has been done by the establishment. The Ponzi scheme, which I'm going to argue, is the way that they advance this truth. We have become intimidated. And I think it's time to stop being intimidated and realize that what we believe about origins makes eminent sense and comports much better with the data that are available than any of the scientific theories that are advanced under the general heading evolutionism. Notice I put that suffix ism on the end of evolutionism. And the reason I'm going to do that, it's a little bit obnoxious, I'm sorry, but we will grapple with this idea that evolution itself is a perfectly respectable word. And every good Christian should believe in evolution. And that may surprise you to hear me say that. That's the technique. We call that a speaker's technique to keep you awake, maybe even on edge. But what we don't believe in is evolutionism, which is a philosophy, a materialist philosophy, an anti-God position, which seeks to push God out of his universe and deny his existence, and say that everything from molecules to man, from bacteria to Beethoven, came about by chance and by nothing else, purposeless, aimless, meaningless, and therefore I get to do whatever I want. So with that introduction, I would like to actually read the first chapter of Genesis together. I'd like to speak for a few minutes about some topics about evolution and creation, about the Bible and science in general, and then we will have a Bible reading on this first chapter of Genesis. Now, just a disclaimer here. I am actually reading out of the New King James Version. This was not approved by the elders. I'm sorry. I trust this won't be too much of a problem. It's not any intent to make any changes or to enforce an agenda. It's simply that I traveled light. I don't have the King James Bible with me. I have the New King James. The wording is very similar, a little bit of updating of the language. So here we go. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. So the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the third day. Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. So God created great sea creatures, and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the sea, and let birds multiply on the earth. So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food. Also, to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. A summary statement then, bringing to a close the seventh day. God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from his work which God had created and made. And I would put the division then right there, rather than where the current divisions are in our Bibles. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about this chapter until we have the Bible reading part. Rather, I'd like to talk a little bit about this creation-evolution controversy and about the Bible and science in general. There have been scientists, I suppose, as long as there have been people. And in civilizations such as ancient Greece, there have been advances made in the natural world, in its understanding and how it works. But primarily, what we think of as modern science began in the 1500s in Europe. And it is a legacy of Christianity. It required Christian belief in order to put into place the very foundational ideas of science. For example, the universe is real. You would say, well, I've always known the universe is real. But interestingly, you may be surprised to learn that there are philosophies even in the world today that believe that reality is an illusion ultimately, and there is no real world. Well, we can put those folks aside. They sound very strange to us. And yet, they do exist, and they did exist. But not when Christianity and what we would call the Judeo-Christian worldview became dominant in Europe, we realized we were dealing with a real universe. We realized that God and the universe were different. Many religions believe that in pantheism, which means that God and the universe are the same. But Christianity said, no, the universe is a product made by God. And since God is rational, the universe is rational. And since God made us, we are rational. So if we apply rationality and our intellect to the orderly world that God has made with its fixed laws, we ought to be able to discover things that we can use to our advantage. This is really part of the creation mandate to subdue the earth. Now, subdue doesn't mean to subjugate and to tromp on or to abuse, but it means to put to good use and to put to expanded use the resources that God has given us. Science does that. Science was ruled over by a king and a queen. The king of science was theology. The queen of science was mathematics. You cannot do science without mathematics. Science cannot answer any questions that it does not measure. If it cannot measure and quantitate, it cannot answer. So math, and implied in that as well, is logical reasoning, are preconditions before you can do science. But I'm going to point out again that at the beginning, theology was the king of science. It was what gave science its very coherence and its very foundation. And also, it was recognized that the decrees of God and the truth of revelation were unassailably true, and that what men found through their finite senses, their limited faculties, their erroneous measurements, their faulty machinery and equipment, their fallible conclusions from their corrupt minds. In other words, I'm saying that there's pitfalls abounding in science that cause it constantly to need to be corrected because misperceptions are made all the time. It was understood that that was somehow lower than the truth that God gave in His Word. What we have today is something very strange. We have people who are standing on the shoulders of Johannes Kepler, who was a Bible-believing Christian who believed in a young earth and creation, Isaac Newton, Nicholas Copernicus, all Christian people, devout people. We could name many more of them. They're standing on their shoulders, but they're denying the very God that was the reason for science's birth to begin with. They're sawing off the limb that they're sitting on. They're robbing the Christian worldview of its foundation and using that for exploitative purposes while denying the very God who is the foundation of science. So that's a very interesting topic. If you want to read more about that, The Biblical Basis of Modern Science by Henry Morris would be an excellent resource. But we'll move on. I just want to make that point that science began with Christianity. It was not only compatible with Christianity, it was considered to be inextricably linked with Christianity. There was no divorce in the minds of early scientists between revelation and reason. And of course, that sounds strange to us today when God has been thoroughly kicked out of the science classrooms of America. But that was not the way it was originally. There are two kinds of science, and we think about science as a way of trying to measure the physical world, to understand it, and to put it to practical uses. So we include science and engineering in this as well. There is something we call operational science, and then something we call forensic science, or we might also call it origins science, specifically when we're talking about the origins of the universe. What are the differences between the two? Well, operational science proceeds this way. You begin with observations. You then say, when you think about the observations and reflect on them for a little bit, I have some questions. Does sugar dissolve in water? Does the earth revolve around the sun? Is there an atmosphere on the moon? Okay, I have questions just based on my observations. And then what I have to do after I've formulated questions is I come down with what I think is the most likely answer. It's provisional, to be sure, but it's the most likely answer based on what I know right now. It's called an hypothesis. Then we set up experiments to try to prove or disprove that hypothesis. The hypothesis has to be something we can ask questions about that can be measured. It has to be something that can be perceived by the five senses or instruments that allow the five senses to go farther. Light microscopy can go 2,000x. That's the limit of the light microscope. And we can't go much farther than that. But with a scanning electron microscope, we can go to 2 million x. So we can look at things that are exceedingly small. And the opposite would be true as well. Telescopes, of course, can go far out into the universe. So we have tools that enable our five senses to go farther than they themselves can go. But we gather these data, and we look at them, and we come down with either a confirmation or a refutation of our hypothesis, our pet hypothesis. This is one issue, of course. It might be a pet hypothesis. It's very hard to get rid of pets. And so scientists are people. They're human. They make mistakes. They have biases. And it's very important to realize that they are not different from you and me. In fact, there probably are some scientists in this room. I might even consider myself one. So we realize that this is a very fallible process by fallible people. So once a hypothesis has been generated and it has been tested and it seems to be true, we advance it to the next stage. We call it a theory. Now, very often at this point, we want to publish our theory. After all, we publish or perish in science, right? So we get it into a journal, and other people read it, and they either say, this is a wonderful insight, I think it's probably true, or they say, this is completely hokey, I have no reason whatsoever to trust this, this sounds ridiculous. And so those people in their laboratories repeat the process, and they're either going to be able to confirm or refute what we believe. If they confirm it, then, of course, we advance farther. We're more sure of our theory, because it has been independently confirmed by more than one person in more than one place. And, of course, theories that are especially strong and have especially stood up well can even be advanced to the highest tier of scientific inquiry, which is the law, like the law of gravity. But we've discovered that even things that enjoyed the privilege of being laws for a while ultimately turned out to be untrue, or at least not fully true. So even Newtonian mechanics, which we thought were obviously laws, the first, second, and third laws of motion, have turned out to be slightly different than Newton thought, based on Einstein's special theory of relativity, for example. So nothing in science is ever 100% sure and can be known with absolute certainty. Even laws must be tentatively held. That doesn't mean we can't use them. We use them all the time. But in the end, we must understand that if a new piece of evidence comes forward that falsifies that law, it will have to be modified. Now, origin science is a very different thing. It certainly comes up with questions as well, but it has no way to measure them. Because what it is doing is it's looking historically at events that only occurred once. Did George Washington cross the Delaware? Well, today people would say, I'd like to get a scientific answer to that. That just shows how much of this hubris of science has permeated the world we live in. Who cares what scientists think about whether George Washington crossed the Delaware? That's a question for historians, not for scientists. Scientists can't speak to that. They have no way of going back there and reproducing the event. They have no way of going into a time warp and watching George Washington cross or not cross. They simply have to take the evidence that is provided by historians and accept or reject it, but science has nothing to do with such a question. And yet we have scientists now that want to go back to the beginning of time and tell us how things began. And to trace the steps from the beginning, even though they were not there, they were not able to measure it, they certainly won't be able to reproduce it in a laboratory, and yet we're to accept that to have the same strength as a scientific experiment that has been reproduced in a laboratory using modern equipment and confirmed at other centers throughout the world. These are two completely different animals. We know forensic science, of course, is used by the police forces, and it's very powerful. If you can pick up DNA evidence, for example, you might be able to show someone on death row is innocent and exonerate the person, and he gets to walk. That would be a wonderful thing. We're glad when that happens. But we all know that even forensic science has its limits, because everything is based on probability and on inferences. And we're talking about something that happened a year or two ago, not 15 billion years ago. So the assumptions we can make about 2013 are much more sure than the assumptions that we can make about 5 billion BCE, as they would say. Throwing Christ out, they want it to be BCE now. Okay, we're going to use BC in this room, okay, before Christ. So I want to make that distinction because when we're talking about evolution and the inquiry into the origin of the universe and the origin of life and the origin of man, the only thing science can say to it is questions can be asked, inferences can be drawn, assumptions can be made, but ultimately nothing can be known for sure because this is not part of operational science. It's basically historical reconstruction. Now, science has some limitations even in the laboratory. I'm just going to go through these quickly. I don't want this to be too boring. I realize it's already been somewhat boring. Such is the nature of the beast. So we plow on, all right? First is the inductive fallacy. You say, what's the inductive fallacy? This is a problem that every scientist has to face. We've already talked about it, but haven't used those terms. Let me set up a couple of examples. All swans are white. We observe swans. We've never seen anything but a white swan. We believe all swans are white. So we come up with this hypothesis, all swans are white. Then we go out into the field and examine it, gather more data, and finally we come to the conclusion this ought to be advanced to a theory, if not a law, because certainly there have been no exceptions. All billiard balls hit by a cue, rather, I guess it's that order, move. Therefore, everything hit by a cue will move. Well, is that true? Well, you can go out and test those things, of course. You find out that the first one appears to be true in North America anyway. All swans are white, but it wouldn't take very much scientific endeavor to figure out that not all things will move when hit by a cue ball, right? Or not a cue ball, by a cue. I'll throw that example out. We're going back to the swans. So then we get a wonderful opportunity to travel to Australia. And we fly to Australia, and we're in great wonderment over the flora and fauna of that country down under. And the first thing we see in the park in Sydney is a black swan. We realize that our theory has got to be modified. In fact, it has to be thrown out. Not all swans are white. There are black swans. And here's the inductive fallacy, and all scientists who are thinkers have admitted this. Even B.F. Skinner and people like Bertrand Russell have been very candid about this. In inductive reasoning, you can never come to an absolute conclusion because you can never see all of the data. You're only able to sample a small part of it. And if in that data set, all the swans are white, that might be a truth that you think you can hang your hat on. But you can never examine all the data. Who's the only one who can examine every piece of data through all the stretches of time in every location of the universe? God. And only God. God was there at the beginning. God saw it happen. God made it happen. God gave infallible witness to what happened. God wrote it down for us. We have an eyewitness account of someone who cannot lie. That's as good as historians can get. And we don't have any scientists who were there who could measure it. Now, we move on. There is also what we could call the deductive fallacy, and that is this. Deductions which are used using logic to work from a theory and to work out its details, to say if A is true, then B and C might be true. There's always the problem that the theory that we're working from could be wrong, and we've explored why that could be. So whether they're inducing, that is, they're going from the specific to the general, or they're deducing, they're going from the general then to the specific, science can never give absolute answers. Any scientist would admit that. And so the only absolute answers we can get come from the infallible God. That is one take-home message from this weekend, all right? That applies to Andrew's meeting and David's meeting, maybe even more than mine, but it certainly applies to mine as well. Having talked a little bit about science in general, its Christian origins, the fact that it is fallible because it's practiced by fallible people, and that only God is infallible, let us talk for a little bit about the creation-evolution controversy for a few minutes, specifically. The first thing I want to say is that evolution is true. Do you all hear me? But evolutionism is false. Now, here's what I mean. Evolution can mean basically three things. For an individual person, the product, the son or daughter of parents, there has been a rearrangement of the genetic material of the mother and the father to produce you, a unique individual. You are different from them. In a sense, we have seen the genetic material evolve into a new form, you. Is that evolution? Well, most people who speak of such a process don't call it that, but it is change in a certain direction. And it has a reason, and it has an outcome, and therefore we would think that's a very valid, obvious example of evolution. But evolution isn't used that way very often. What it's used mainly of is the variations within a species or a kind of animal or plant. So these animals share what's called a gene pool, right? And all the animals would have two copies if they are diploid animals, which most are, and they have two copies of each gene. So any given gene, whether it's the gene for that when it's defective causes sickle cell disease, or when it's defective causes cystic fibrosis. You have 2 copies of these genes, and for some diseases, only one has to be defective for you to become ill. In other cases, both have to be defective for you to become ill. But throughout the population, all of us have 2 copies. And yet there are many variations of these. And so when something happens to stress the population, when a new antibiotic comes into a swill of bacteria, the ones that are able to resist that bacteria have a selective advantage, and they will begin to grow while the others will decline. You can see this in Darwin's finches. You can see this in the peppered moths. This is called microevolution. It is absolutely true. It is wise, and it is the product of a divine mind, which allowed the creation that he had made to rebound from stresses imposed on it and to adapt itself to its environment, so that those who were most fit would survive, and those who were less fit would have a disadvantage and would be either die off or would become very much a minority concern in the population. Most of what you hear about as evolution, most of what is written as proofs of evolution, most of the real-life examples of evolution that are provided to you in the classroom fit into this horizontal change paradigm, okay? So we're talking about existing species with existing genes, a finite defined gene pool, and the rearrangement of that gene pool in individuals, making this trait more common and this one less common because of selective pressure. This is all true, and it's all wise, and it's all God. This has always been going on, and this is something we ought to be very thankful for, and it is something that we utilize all the time. Plant breeders accelerate this process, and I would say distort it a little bit, and so do animal breeders. They're working within a gene pool. They cannot create new genetic material, but they can manipulate the genetic material they have in the dog so that they can create more hair or less hair, more height, less height, a dog that points or a dog that chases, a dog that grabs the prey, a dog that doesn't like grab the prey, a dog that chews it up, and a dog that doesn't. Whatever they want to breed into it, they can do that. Now, when humans get involved, they mess things up, though, right? So animals that are left to breed themselves in nature become stronger and stronger. People who want traits that are not necessarily good for the animal create specimens that are weaker and weaker. That's why when you want to raise beef cattle, you don't raise purebreds. You hybridize. You take an Angus bull and you breed it with a Hereford cow, and you get a non-pure cross, we call it heterosis, which is going to have more strength and is going to grow faster and is going to be less ill than the purebred because it has not been manipulated by people. But enough said. This is microevolution. These are horizontal changes. They are workings within a gene pool that already existed, created by God, and this happens all the time. Now here's where the giant leap comes from. We've talked about individual people having evolved from their ancestors. We've talked about populations of people or dogs or plants that change over time based on changes in gene frequency in the population. Okay, so far so good. Now we're going to take the giant leap into the abyss. And we're going to say that because there can be variation within a species, that one species can turn into another species. And to do so, that first species can acquire, magically, new genetic material. From where, we don't know. And they can become higher and more complex, so that lower forms, given enough time, and we're talking deep time here, billions of years, can slowly but surely climb the ladder, acquiring more and more genetic material, turning themselves into creatures that are very, very different from their ancestors, and therefore the whole tree of life springs up from a single cell. So as I said before, molecules at the beginning, all the way to man, or if you will, bacteria to Beethoven, all right? That kind of molecules to man evolution is a vertical change. It's what's called macroevolution, and it is wrong. It's never been observed to occur in the laboratory. It cannot be proven from the fossil record. It makes no sense based on the laws of thermodynamics, which we'll discuss briefly. Therefore, it can be categorically rejected. That is the Ponzi scheme. Now, you know Bernard Madoff made off with about $50 billion. And Bernard Madoff is the Ponzi man, okay? Although Ponzi was the first Ponzi man, I suppose. I doubt he was, actually. This is a pretty brilliant idea. I'm sure somebody thought of this many centuries ago. In a Ponzi scheme, what you have to do is you've got to just convince the next people below you of the truth of what you're saying, even though the people above you know it's not true, so that you can get more and more converts and, frankly, more and more money. And we have an intellectual establishment in this country controlled by the prince of the power of the air. And don't think I'm a conspiratorialist in every sense, but I am in this sense. This is an orchestrated effort to put God out of existence, or at least make him irrelevant. It is an orchestrated effort to intimidate Christians and to make them seem like fools. It's a way to get power and money for the establishment, allowing them to become enriched, to gain more control over education and therefore over the people, and ultimately to triumph in that sense and to enjoy lavish and debauched lives. Now, I'm not suggesting by such a cynical statement that all scientists are like that, but the thinkers among them have said, and they've said it clearly, that their reason to throw God out and to reject creationism, the reason they embraced Darwinism so enthusiastically was because it allowed them to have the sexual freedom that they wanted. You can read it in their writings, Aldous Huxley, Julian Huxley, others. So they don't want to be accountable to God. They don't want God's morality, and this is a way for them to escape it. Now, when you're talking about something that ultimately has no substance, that cannot be proven, that is based on whims and presuppositions, you're talking about a Ponzi scheme. You're talking about something that is ultimately deceptive. And yet it has worked its way through higher education so that all of us now feel cowed and intimidated if we come into a classroom and say we believe God created the heavens and the earth in 6 literal days. But that's what we do believe. And therefore we need to understand that this, to change the metaphor, the emperor has no clothes. And we're going to call him naked because he's naked. Macroevolution is not true. Microevolution is wonderfully true. That's why we need to be very clear on this point. This is what linguists or philosophers call equivocation. If you have one word and it can mean 2 things, and it's convenient to take the 2 meanings and blend them together so that the weak position is strengthened by the strong one, that's what you do. And our job is to dissect them and say, no, they're 2 different things entirely, and we believe this one and we reject that one. So no new genetic material has ever been made, and there's no mechanism by which to make it. I'm going to put the accelerator on. There's so many things we could say, but we want to spend most of this time in Bible study. I want to talk about observations from the past, as well as the fact that we have lack of evidence in current laboratory conditions. Let me start that one over. This is a better way to put it. You go to the evolutionists and you say, okay, you believe in macroevolution, you believe that molecules turned into man, you believe that things go higher and higher and acquire new genetic material and can become transformationally different from their ancestors. Show it to me. Prove it. Show me. And the evolutionist says, okay, well, we'll have a look. We'll go to the laboratory. We'll show it to you there. So he says, look, see these fruit flies? We bombard them with ionizing radiation, and they lose their wings. That's proof that mutations cause evolution. Well, you say a couple of things here. First of all, in what sense is that fruit fly advanced in its abilities and function by losing its wings? Probably not very much. Number 2, you're working within a genetic pool that you have not increased or improved. You're talking about microevolution, not macro. I asked you for proof of macroevolution, speciation. So let's get out of the laboratory, unless you can show me something in the laboratory. And he goes, well, no. Speciation works far too slowly to see it in the laboratory. So you say, okay, you can't see it in the laboratory. All you see there is microevolutionary horizontal changes. No vertical changes, no improvement, no development of one species from another, no magic formation of new genetic material. So where do you have evidence for this? The fossil record. So then we're going to geology, all right? So we go to the geological formations of the Earth, and we find out that there are basically 2 types of rock out there. There's 3 types, actually, but we'll talk about 2 here. Igneous rock. This is like granite and feldspar and basalt, and this is all completely free of fossils. There are no fossils in such rocks. The other major type of rock was laid down by flooding. It's called sedimentary rock. This would include limestone, sandstone, and shale, and coal as well, although that's not truly a rock. Now, these things are full of fossils. So we look at those fossils, and what we discover is that we have the sudden appearance of fully formed and functional species. Some of them are now extinct, but at the time they lived, they were fully formed and fully functional. They show no evolutionary change from one kind to another that is not highly questionable. It looks very neat on the pages of a biology textbook, but in reality, this horse series and the whale series and so forth are figments of imagination and can be openly refuted. So we stayed with the rocks in the fossil record, and we realized that in that fossil record we have the sudden appearance of species fully formed. They show little or no variation, and they either persist to the present or they go out of existence. They become extinct. So you say, where's the speciation in that? Well, they say, it happened too fast to see it there. Well, wait a minute. You said it was too slow to see it in the laboratory. And now we're out here in the rocks, and you're saying it's too fast to see it here. It was too fast. This is what Richard Goldschmidt used to call the hopeful monsters, or this is saltationism, or punctuated equilibrium, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. Those of you who have been in school recognize these people and these ideas. And this is that, for the most part, species remain very, very stable and static through all these years. But just because the Earth's magnetic field may have switched, or there was a big influx of ionizing radiation, or some catastrophe happened in a very brief period of time, there was a sudden flurry of evolution. And then everything came to a new equilibrium, so punctuated equilibrium. Now, since the punctuations are such short periods of time, and the equilibrium things are such long periods of time, of course all the fossils that you're going to see by chance are likely to be those from the equilibrium state, so they're going to not show evolution. The evolution occurred in the places you can't see it. So I'm saying, okay, this is advancing some field of knowledge by the lack of evidence. We have no evidence for this in the laboratory. We have no evidence for it in the rock formations. So where do you see it? The answer is you don't. It's a Ponzi scheme. Now, if I sound very dismissive or very cynical or very, I realize this is a friendly environment. I'm preaching to the choir. I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, as they say. But I'm serious about what I'm saying, and I think it's important that we remain intellectually rigorous and do not use the kinds of faulty arguments the other side uses. But at the end of the day, what I have said is true. And therefore, it's a Ponzi scheme. Okay? We move on. Just briefly here. Deductions from the laws of science, I want to say a couple of things. They say that the universe came into existence out of nothing. This violates the first law of thermodynamics, that is the conservation of energy and matter. The law simply states that energy, or as we know from E equals mc squared, energy and matter are interconvertible. So mass energy can neither be created or destroyed. That is to say, there is no such thing as an effect without a cause. So we say, give us that again. Run that by us again. How did the universe begin? Well, at a period of time, around 15 billion years ago, there was a sudden explosion, and nothing generated something. And the universe exploded into being. So we say, okay, if it exploded into being, what was it before it was being? And they say, well, if it wasn't being, I suppose it was non-being. That's good. So it was non-being. So if it was non-being, what's another word for non-being? Another word for non-being is nothing. All right? And I didn't need to come all the way from Michigan to tell you folks, nothing can't explode. Okay? This is the folly. Professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. There was a debate I was watching where William Lane Craig was debating Peter Atkins. When I was in physical chemistry, I used Peter Atkins' textbook. But Peter Atkins left academic chemistry to become an atheist. He's not one of the good ones, by the way. He's a bad debater. So when William Lane Craig had him painted into the corner very nicely, he said, well, at the end of the day, nothing exists. Because all reality is the separation of positive and negative charges. And if they were allowed to implode back on each other, you would have nothing. This takes a PhD, okay? You have to have tenure to be this good, okay? This is the folly of people who have rejected the clear revelation of Scripture. They do become fools. And again, this is potentially an ad hominem argument, calling someone you disagree with a fool. I'm saying his arguments are foolish, all right? The man may be brilliant. This is one of the problems with our folks in school is these people are smart. They are well educated. They are intimidating in that way. You feel that you're intellectually far the inferior of these people. So you let them intimidate you. And you shouldn't do that because the truth is on your side and the truth will prevail. Another point to be made quickly, and I will stop at the hour. Will I? Okay, I will. Is that evolution cannot be true, not only because it doesn't exist in the laboratory, not only because it cannot be proven from the fossil record, not only because it breaks the first law of thermodynamics, but because it breaks the second law as well. The second law says that no process can be fully efficient. Therefore, the effect cannot be greater than the cause. Everything that requires energy will release some of that energy in a useless form called heat. So on a hot summer's day, you're in your kitchen. You say, boy, it's hot in here. I think I'll open the refrigerator door. That will cool the room down. Will it? No, it will heat the room up. Because now your compressor is going to be running nonstop because the door is open. And the amount of cooling that occurs inside the refrigerator must, by the second law of thermodynamics, be less than the amount of heat generated by the compressor. So the net gain in temperature will be positive, and the kitchen will heat up. That's the way life is. Nothing can be fully efficient. Therefore, things that are effects cannot be greater in complexity than their causes in a closed system. Now, I grew up from a little boy to a man, and people put together 747s out of 4.5 million non-flying parts. So that seems to be against entropy, but it isn't, because that's a closed system. And the amount of energy it took to make me grow up, or to put together the plane, was more than counterbalanced by a waste of energy and, of course, the generation of heat, which is random molecular motion. And, of course, the whole universe is going toward a heat death. And over billions of years of time, the universe will be motionless, and it will be at 4 degrees Kelvin, according to predictions, and nothing will happen. Everything will be random motion. That's the apocalypse, I suppose, of the evolutionist. Not very apocalyptic, but it's certainly the end of what they see the world being. So, therefore, to have complex organisms arise out of less complex organisms breaks that law. I'm going to save some of these other things for our Bible reading, which will begin momentarily. I just want to talk for a minute, though, about some of the consequences of evolution beyond the fact that it has co-opted science. Racism existed before Darwin. Darwin made racism respectable. Not so much today, because there's a giant attempt to push it back and to distance themselves from it. But we know the eugenics movement. We know Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger. We know that Adolf Hitler and the attempt to eliminate Jews and gypsies and black people all were based on Darwinian thinking. That was the scientific underpinning of something that existed before, but had now been made respectable because it was scientific. And the purges and the tremendous iniquity of the 20th century under people like Pol Pot and the killing fields and Mao and Hitler and, of course, Lenin and Stalin, all of whom were evolutionists, all of whom were Darwinians, shows that this kind of theory, whether it be true or not, and it's not, will produce nefarious things in society. Now, people, as I say, are attempting to backpedal from that, but what was the origin of what was the title of Darwin's book? The Origin of Species, which is the thing he did not show, by the way. He did not show that. So the title of his book is false. He did not show that. He shows everything but that in the book. He did not show the origin of species. By natural selection, which is a tautology, or the development of the favored races. That's the subtitle of the book. This leads, of course, to the cheapening of human life, because a boy is a bat is a dog, is a cat. This is a quote, believe it or not, saying that there is no superiority to human beings. We're just animals after all. We can behave like animals and we can kill each other like animals. We have no inherent value. We have no meaning. It doesn't matter if we're germs. If the white germs want the black germs to sit on the back of the bus, who's to say that's wrong? Because this is all meaningless. We have no value. We have no personal human value, if this be true. At the same time, paradoxically, when God is pushed out, the human being fills the void of the deity. And we have people now worshiping themselves. Self-worship and the entirely solipsistic type of self-pleasing, self-centered mindset that is so common today, far more than historically, although people have always been meists, far more today, is clearly a product of this as well. I'm thinking about the selfie. I'm thinking about people taking selfies. Well, that's partly because they have cameras that can do that. But why would people want to take pictures of themselves? Because they're interested in themselves more than they are other people, right? They want to broadcast themselves on YouTube. They want to, blah, blah, blah. I'm not against technology. I'm just saying this entirely self-centered atmosphere that we live in certainly would be a product of evolution as well. I'm going to stop at this point. I went quite long, but I think that such is the nature of this discussion. I'd like to take a break for about 10 minutes. I hope that what I've done is actually provoke some thought in this first part that we can flesh out and talk about more in the second part. I'd like now to move to a discussion of Genesis chapter 1, but I'd like to give you about 5 minutes, okay, to stretch and reconvene, and we'll reconfigure up here. I'd like to introduce to you as well, not David Peterson, he's well known to you, but my brother Andrew Robertson from Chatham, Ontario, who's kindly agreed to come along and help us this weekend. Some of you know him from conferences in other places, but if you don't know him, he's a wonderful man, and we're glad he's here. So, with that, you are now dismissed until we reconvene at about 10 after. This, I want to say a couple of things. There are good, Bible-believing, faithful people, good expositors of Scripture, without nefarious motives, who have very different ways of understanding the first three verses of Genesis chapter 1. So if your view differs from mine, I don't mind if you express it. We can talk about it. And I'm not going to suggest that you're not able to interpret God's Word properly because you don't agree with me. I mean, that would be arrogant, and I don't hold that position. I do believe, though, that some of the theories, specifically I'm thinking of either the soft or hard gap, are ultimately compromises because they were developed at a time when the Bible was under tremendous pressure to comport with scientific theories of the time. We can go to 1859, which was the year that the origin of species by natural selection, and I mentioned the development of the favored races, was first published by Charles Darwin. Darwin did not invent evolution. Everybody knows that. I think ancient Greeks had evolutionary theories, for example. But he brought it to a world and gave it a certain scientific respectability at a time when the world was crying for a way to get out from under the authority of Scripture. And the minute that it was published, as well as the companion truth of uniformitarianism, that's a geology kind of thing developed by Charles Lyell, that said the present is the key to the past and the future, and that what is true today has always been true and always will be true. That's obviously a philosophical position that can't be proven. But Lyell said that, and he said, therefore, looking at the Grand Canyon or something of that nature, that the world must be billions of years old. So you take deep time, and you combine it with the scientific respectability of Charles Darwin, 1859, you now have a scientific basis to throw God out. The church began to scramble at that time, if I can use the word church in that sense, Christians. And we had Thomas Chalmers come up with the idea that deep time could be fit into Genesis while still maintaining the 24-hour creation days if you insert it between verses 1 and 2. C.I. Scofield further popularized this in the Scofield Bible, which many of us were born and bred with. And, of course, we can discuss some of that today. Those were two wonderful Christian people. I'm not disparaging them or suggesting that they really were compromisers in any sense. But the general reason to come up with that kind of teaching at the time in the late 19th century was to accommodate science. And one thing we do not want to do is accommodate forensic science. We understand that operational science has a lot more strength and we need to pay more attention to it. And it always agrees with the Bible. But the reconstruction of what happened in the universe 15 billion years ago is not operational science, and the Bible will always trump what the scientist says. In 1959, roughly, 100 years later, we had the publication of the Genesis flood. Actually, I think it was 1960, but for the purposes of my little scheme, we'll pretend it was 1959. Okay? We had now a respectable, and whether you're a young earth creationist and a flood geologist or not, we now had a plausible explanation for geology and for the origins of the universe that fit with Genesis. And we saw a lot of people who had been gappers through those 100 years revert back to the position that I personally am taking today, that there is no gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. At the end of the day, we can agree to disagree. But anyway, that's my little introductory piece on the first couple of verses. Let's reread them together. We'll do this section by section. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. Now I'm going to ask my brothers to come in on these verses, but I'll begin in this way. I believe the first statement in verse 1 is a summary statement, just as the last statement that we read in Genesis 2, verse 3, is a summary statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is what we call a merism in language. It has to do with the idea of summarizing the totality of something with two words. We talk about, I searched high and low for that lost pin. High and low means I searched everywhere. So the expression the heavens, plural, and the earth is a way of talking about the entire cosmos. Now, how that was done will be explained in the rest of the chapter. It was not all a Big Bang. And I'm not saying that some of the truth of the Big Bang couldn't comport with Genesis, by the way. I don't think the 15 billion years. But I think at the same time, we're going to stick with what the scriptures talk about. And that is that the earth, according to what the text says in the straightforward reading, was actually the first thing that was made in the heavens and the earth. Nevertheless, I take verse 1 to be a summary statement. Now, there are elements, this is where we'll begin our discussion, in this first verse that are very interesting. In the beginning is what? Time. God, a person and a force, created an action, the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. There are 5 entities in this verse. First of all, the big 3, which is time, space, and mass energy. So this is perfectly scientific, as we would say, in our understanding of it. As well, science can explore 5 different things. It can explore time, and it can explore space, and it can explore mass energy and action and causation. So all these elements are contained in verse 1. Any comments about verse 1 then and the word God or any of these words would be welcome.
Beside the heaven and the earth, the Lord God also created the angelic hosts, and principally Lucifer himself. And he had a vast play in the judgment of God subsequent to that. And then we go to verse 2, where the earth became void and waste. And there is, in my understanding, and this is where I'd like some commentary on this, with respect to your point about this integral, that it was that judgment, that rebelliousness that Ezekiel talks about, the 5 I wills of Lucifer, that produced this and caused God's judgment and wrath to cause this earth to be void and So I'm led to understand, and I do have a Schofield Bible,
All right.
that there was some Israel. We don't know, we cannot ascertain whether it was into the millions or billions of years, but there was some pause, if you will, because verse 1 clearly states, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. Pause. There's a stop there.
Okay, thank you that you've articulated the so-called hard gap theory very well, and I appreciate that because I do want to talk about it, and I'm going to concede that that is a point many good people take. I do believe that we can infer that Lucifer and the angels were created very early in the process because we know from Job that the sons of God sang together for joy when the earth's foundation was laid. So the spirit beings were created early. Where I would differ from that is I don't believe Lucifer's fall occurred in this gap. At the end of this week, God pronounced everything that he had made and called it very good. That would be one argument against it. It also brings in other implications that we will have to discuss later. If you accept that, then you must accept many other things that go along with it. It's a package deal. So you would have to accept death and judgment prior to this creation week. You would have to, presumably hard gappers are going to put fossils in that gap as part of the original created earth, of which the Bible does not speak. That means certainly animal death. It also creates a problem of how do you have genetic continuity between animals prior to that judgment and current animals which are the same morphologically. True, there are some animals like, say, dinosaurs that people want to scoot into the original earth and exclude from the present earth. But there are also many animals which are still in existence today. So there are certainly problems with that. But you've articulated it well, and I'm not, I think everyone will have to come to his or her own conclusion.
If I could add a couple things, just that I've always wondered why, if there was a judgment of God on Lucifer, and I believe there was, and it took place here, how could him being sent to earth be a punishment? How could him being sent to what God just created and would call very good be in any sense a punishment on Lucifer? I would say, too, that in your passage in Ezekiel 28, where it refers to Lucifer's fall, that it states clearly that he was in Eden when iniquity was found in him. Now, we're told in Genesis 2 that then the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in Genesis 2. So if he was in Eden when iniquity was found in him, how could he have fallen before that period of time, before he was in the garden? I would tend to, I don't know what David or Andrew or any of the brethren think. I don't know that Satan's fall took place before we even come into Genesis 3.
So give Satan some clarity. Are you saying that this heaven and earth that God created was without form and void?
What do those words mean?
Okay, that's a great next topic. Isaiah 45, verse 7 says, "The Lord did not create the earth to be without form and void." Notice how I stated that. The verse does not say that God did not create the earth without form and void. It says God did not create the earth to be without form and void. That is to say, that verse does not apply to verse 1 of Genesis 1. It applies to verses 1 through 31 of Genesis 1. God did not create the earth to be without form and empty. These words are not the dark satanic words that people want to make them out to be. It simply means the earth was unformed and unfilled. God will then form it in the first 3 days and fill it in the last 3 days, in other words, 4 through 6, and rest on the seventh. Unformed and unfilled, you have all kinds of motivated readings, I would call them, that want to make this chaos, iniquitous, I don't know if that's the right word, sure sign of judgment, something greatly awry, something that is catastrophic. When what it simply says is that the original substrate God made was only a substrate and that it needed to be A, formed, and B, filled. So what does God do in the rest of the week? He forms it, day 1, 2, and 3, and then he fills it, day 4, 5, and 6. That's the way my outline is constructed, by the way. So that would be my understanding. Now, grammarians are all over the map on this. Again, we have to argue that some may have motivated reasons for wanting to translate things certain ways. But from the very most liberal translators, such as the Anchor Bible, all the way to the most conservative, say, for example, New American Standard Bible, you will find that there is a continuity between Genesis 1, 2, and 3 that grammatically cannot be broken. For example, the Anchor Bible reads this way. It takes the original verb in the first verb to be in what's called a construct state instead of an absolute state. And I just make that statement so you can look that up later if you're interested in such things. But that would make the translation, when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Clearly showing that there can't be a gap that way. Others take verse 2 to be parenthetical. When in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and by the way, the earth was unformed and unfilled, and darkness was the face of the waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering, then God said, let there be light. In that sense, then, grammatically, you have verse 1 and verse 3 cemented together with verse 2 being a parenthesis. Regardless of that, I mean, in addition to that, we have the idea that the first verb can be taken in an absolute state, which is how our King James and others that we're more familiar with would translate it. So then it's, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That becomes the main clause. And what follows are some subordinate clauses that explain how he did it. Again, verse 2 could be taken parenthetically. There's many permutations of this, and I don't want to belabor it too long. But what this follows is something called a vav consecutive. And. This is a Hebrew mechanism by which things are joined together like a daisy chain with no breaks in between, so that statement A is immediately followed by statement B, and B followed by C, and they're all linked together grammatically by the conjunction vav in Hebrew. This is another way that even the most conservative scholars have suggested that these three verses should be taken as a unit. So we've heard both sides of the argument. You'll have to make up your own mind. Now, I'm sorry to do all the talking here, but I just want to make one more point. John Lennox is what I would call a soft gapper. We've heard the hard gap articulated. The soft gap does not see Satan's fall or a judgment occurring between 1 and 2, does not see without form and void as being judgmental words, understands the unformed and unfilled thing, but it seeks to segregate verse 1 from the rest of the chapter and put a big agnostic gap in the middle that says, yes, things could be 15 billion years old, but at the beginning of Genesis 1, 2, God began the creative process as we understand it. Now, again, I've just made some grammatical points that would seem to argue against that. Nevertheless, I respect John Lennox. That's the way John Lennox works with Richard Dawkins and others. Because if he walked on the stage as a young earth creationist, they would laugh him off the stage. They would want to talk about nothing else but that. And so it's much more respectable for William Lane Craig and John Lennox to be old earth creationists, because they can nicely sidestep this most controversial point that the Bible clearly implies that the earth is young. So I'll make that point. That's a third variation.
And I'll just want to add one other thing. As far as the phrase without form and void, I like unformed and unfilled. Those two words are brought together again in Scripture in Jeremiah 4, when Jeremiah tells the people what's going to happen to Jerusalem if they persist in their sin. And he says, and he's using the language of Genesis 1 and 2 purposefully. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. And then goes on to explain what that means by saying, thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate. So what I think it means, especially the word void, it means that there's nothing there. It's completely gone. Now, if it means there was a judgment on Satan and all of these fossils and everything, that's something. That's not just something there, that's a lot there. But what I think the word indicates, as David has said, is that there's absolutely nothing there. And that's what Jeremiah is saying to the people. If you continue on, there will be nothing here. You will be completely taken away. This will be nothing but waste and desolation.
David, can I just want to go back to in the beginning. John 1 and 1, it says, in the beginning God
Was the Word.
was the Word. How do you explain that in that beginning compared to this in Genesis 1?
Well, in the beginning, in John 1:1, I suggest is looking back before the beginning of time. That is, at the beginning, the Logos was already there. The Word was pre-existent. In Genesis 1:1, the same expression, in the beginning, I think is the inception of time and what follows. Put the two together, we have the Word preceding time, preceding creation, preceding mass energy, and it was by His powerful Word that all things came into being. We know that, right? The Word is a wonderful expression of the Lord Jesus. Two things. Number one, notice everything in this chapter is fiat creation. It's called F-I-A-T. That's not an Italian car, by the way. That means, in Latin, let there be. And it's simply the Word of God. Psalm 33, He spake and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. So God unleashes His power by His Word, and He still does that today. He saves people today by His powerful Word, the Bible. More than that, calling Him the Word tells us of the immense wisdom, information, and informatics, if we will, that are built into the universe. As I was flying through that topic on genetics there when I was opening the meeting, one of the things evolution cannot account for is the infusion of information into the universe. Now, Dennis, if I gave you a CD-ROM that was empty, a CD-R we used to call them, no, a CD-WR, whatever, they're all obsolete now, and it had nothing on it, and you went and put all your favorite music on it and handed it back to me, would it weigh any more? No, it wouldn't weigh any more. The medium was changed only in one respect, that organization was put into it, code was put into it, wisdom, information was put into it. And that is the Word of John 1, putting information, instruction, DNA code, and all of the wonderful laws that we have. So I see that all in the linkage there between John 1 and 1 and Genesis 1 and 1.
Amy, can I ask a general question, a little bit more higher level question, which is, what is the limits of science and the Bible? In other words, can we look at Genesis 1 as a way of explaining how the universe works? Or is that the purpose of God for giving us Genesis 1? So what is the purpose for which God has given us this chapter? Is this something that we use to fight against scientists, or is this something, what is the spiritual value of Genesis 1?
I'll give an initial answer, but I'd like to hear what you have to say as well. This was given by Moses to the children of Israel. They were a separated people, a people belonging to the Lord. They had been redeemed, and they were about to enter into the promised land. This was a way of understanding their origins and understanding their God. It was a way of showing how God had separated the light from the darkness. He had separated the waters above and below. He had separated the dry land from the seas. He was a God of separation and distinction. And He had separated and made distinct His own people. And they were to understand the very character of the God who had saved them and redeemed them and brought them into the promised land. So it has a spiritual value. And the main purpose of it is for us to worship, not to fight scientists. There is a danger, though, in saying that it has only a theological purpose, because it invites people then to allegorize it, spiritualize it, make it into myth, and say that all we have to get is the general gist that God is awesome out of it, and all the particulars can be negotiated away because they don't matter. And the Bible's not a science textbook, and when it speaks, it doesn't speak with authority in scientific matters. That would be dangerous, because at the end of the day, it is also truth. What is your take on
No,
it?
I was going to say the same thing. You
Okay.
said in a much better way. I mean, there is a limit. The Bible was not written to prove science. It was not written as a defense of science. It was written to, it's the beginning of the redemptive story, and it begins with the idea that God is a God of creation and glory. It begins with this image of God as being this all-powerful, omniscient, and omnipresent God. And this is the God that brought the world into existence. So it's really a call to worship. Like you said, the sons of God were rejoicing in creation, and looking at God calling this forth was something that caused them to worship, and that ought to evoke the same kind of worship in us.
Amen. Good.
So Genesis 1 is an apologetic in itself from its historical context. Just the fact that if Moses is writing this to a people that were in a polytheistic environment, many gods, they had mythological texts in Egypt, and we see this with the magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, and their competing works against Moses' works. And we see this in the language here, don't we? A lot of the mythology that came out of Egypt had, wars of many gods, and the one god that defeated the other gods ended up making man to be slaves, and so man is secondary, and man doesn't have value. And so is he not writing immediately to the children of Israel and pointing them back to their origins? It mattered to them in such a way, and it matters to us deeply today as well, doesn't it? Maybe from a different context, but for a very similar purpose.
I agree, Andrew. Some people talk about Genesis 1 demythologizing what the children of Israel would have learned from pagan sources. The Enuma Elish, for example, a Babylonian text, talks about the creation and follows some similar order to this, but with some very grotesque distortions. We have Tiamat, the god of the deep, being split into two, and her body, it was a she, becomes the firmament above and the earth below. We have so you hear a ring of truth to it, and yet all the gross pagan distortion. We have the worship of the sun and the moon. Genesis 1 doesn't call them the sun and moon. It doesn't use the words. It says the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. It deliberately demythologizes the text and shows this was the truth. Now, from that, we should never assume, as some, I think, very bad historians who have an anti-God bias have done, that Genesis was somehow borrowed from the Enuma Elish. Not at all. The oral tradition was far older than Moses. The oral tradition goes back, and the truth of it is actually confirmed by the fact that the pagans had something to distort, right? But Moses says, no, this is the truth. I'm going to demythologize this. All of the false gods, all of the pagan ideas are going to be stripped away. This is the way it really was at the beginning.
So can I make this relevant to us today in a sense that, take the prosperity gospel, for instance, it is much darker than it looks. It's not just come to Jesus, he'll make you wealthy and healthy, but there's a reason why they're saying that, and it goes right back to Genesis 1. And the idea that they will tell you is that you are the offspring of God, therefore you are a little God, made in the image of God. So they're distorting again Genesis 1 and 2, and they come at it, and when the fall happened, they say the Creator God was locked out of his world, and so when a person is converted, God needs you to be wealthy and healthy and powerful. He needs you to work miracles. He needs you. In fact, they will say prayer isn't to ask God for things. It's actually to tell God, command God to do things. So it's much darker than it looks. And it all comes back to Genesis 1. It starts there. That's where the false gospels come out of. And that's why Genesis 1 is crucial to the true gospel. Because it is the origins of everything else that we believe.
Just a statement to which I got over before I thought was excellent with the foundation of science. When I've spoken with people, I always try to explain, if you look it up in the dictionary, look up on the internet, they'll say science is really a systematic organization of facts. So we use this word science like it's, the world uses it like they become the theologians of old. And science is the pinnacle of everything to the people that don't believe. And if you look in the New Testament, you have in Romans, it talks about things like that, it talks about in 1 Corinthians, that when we speak the Bible, it's going to sound as foolishness. But what's happened is the world has replaced the theologian who points us at God for truth to science. That's not what science is. Science is an organization of facts which we put in use to say we have some knowledge about something that we can work with in the real life world. Which means that science does not look at the supernatural. I say it slowly because if I say supernatural, like, whoa, stop. We all believe in the supernatural. That means outside of the natural world. God is outside of the natural world. What does science measure? The natural world. So science, by definition, cannot measure things that happen supernaturally. So if you use Genesis 1 to call it a book of science, whoa, there are facts in Genesis 1, and it's an organized, systematic arrangement of facts which brings us knowledge about the supernatural, which you cannot measure and understand the way you're going about it. So your whole premise is completely foolish and outside of what the Bible is trying to do, and it really tends to knock us as Christians out of balance. What are we saying? So I had a person one time, I was speaking with my college, and he said, well, God is very convenient for you. I said, yes, it's very convenient. I'm okay with the convenience of God, because he created it and said it, he did it. That's fine. It's inconvenient for you, because none of the things you can measure can do what he did. Yes, he spoke the worlds into being. He can do that. He did it, no problem. Here's how he wrote it out. So when you read this book, realize there are things in here that are supernatural. That means they're outside of the measurement abilities of science. Can't be done. There are miracles here, but you can't repeat. I'll give you two definitions for a miracle. Something that happens one time, Jesus walks on water. That's a good miracle. I'll tell you another miracle. I speak about it all the time. The very fact that you can hear my voice is a miracle. And the very fact that I can come up with a thought and process it through parts of my brain, which David can tell you about, and put it into words, and I can speak Italian, it's like this, and you see my face, and it goes across the room, it's going into all your ears, through the hair, and there are people here that speak other languages, it gets translated, and it all goes down in and becomes the thought that you want. That's a miracle. Cannot be explained by science. I'm not talking about the mechanism of the molecules, I'm talking about the thought process and all of everything else. It's a miracle. So there are miracles that happen every day which we can't explain, which we don't count as miracles because it happens every day. A blade of grass, it's a miracle. If my brother-in-law Dave invented a blade of grass, he'd be considered a miracle scientist. But he didn't. And it's kind of common, so we go, it's a blade of grass. It's a miracle. You're surrounded by God's miracles to show you how wonderful God is. That's the whole purpose here. So when you get to a debate, you can't win a debate. And I like to go where it says in Corinthians it says, but the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And it says that unto the Jews he's a stumbling block, but unto the Greeks he's foolishness. So we're speaking to the Greeks. They do not understand or believe in the supernatural. To them it is just the natural world. To the Hebrews, they understood the supernatural, and this made sense. Oh, that's how this works. So we got them down. So be careful when you talk about this or think about it yourself. It's true. I'll give you one last thing. Ask anyone to display to me, is love real, and how do you measure love? Because it's real. Ask any naturalist, how do you measure the love of your wife? How do you measure the love of your husband? The love of mom, the love of dad. How do you measure that? It's real. How do you measure it? You can't see it. It's invisible. And you can lead them right to the verse that said, God demonstrated his love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So there's invisible things of God that are not measurable by science, but we measure by experience and seeing what was done for us in the world around us. I don't know if that helps.
It helps a lot. You've demythologized the word science for us, actually, which is very helpful. Yeah. I mean, this is a word, scientia, which simply means knowledge. And we make it into a religion, which, of course, they've made it into. And now they have high priests, Richard Dawkins and company. They have an apocalypse, global warming, if not the heat death of the universe. They have an origin. They have everything but a sacrifice and a redemption.
And you can always watch. It's usually backwards. See, they start with a Big Bang. We end with it. It's just backwards. The elements will melt with fervent heat. They think the elements came out of fervent heat. It's just backwards.
But their assumption, as you say, is that there's only a natural world. There's two things that dominate philosophy today, and we imbibe this if we don't understand what we're up against. Number one, is materialism. By that I don't mean I want a Cadillac and 3 luxury homes. I don't mean that kind of materialism. I mean that materialism is all there is. There is nothing but matter. That means you have no spirit. You have no soul. There is no purpose. You do not have free will. You do what your molecules determine that you should do. And at the end, you mean nothing. Coupled with that is logical positivism, as in Ayer and John Stuart Mill, and that is that scientific investigation is the only way to find truth, because it speaks to matter, and matter is all there is. If you don't understand that that's what's being pushed into your little brains, then you will perhaps not defend yourself against it. There is much reality that is beyond the material world, and we've just heard about love, for example, right?
There's one other piece of research I'll just say now, so I won't say it later. But right now we have a world existing in the scriptures here without life. There's no life on the earth here that's written. And now life is going to be created by God in the further parts of this chapter. So go to a scientist and ask them, well, tell me how life was created on Earth. And they'll tell you that we can create, they don't know how you get life. I was thinking about this. I went to a science museum and they had inorganic material. They were taking rocks and breaking them up, saying, we're helping evolution, we're doing it faster. And then they were putting seeds in it, trying to get them to grow. And they found out they don't grow in the sterile rock. They had to have seeds. So the reality is you cannot grow anything in dirt that's sterile. It has to have some biological material in it. I went, okay, well then how did the first thing in the ocean, in the biological soup, pop out, because life is required by definition, science definition, to be able to get energy, be able to recreate, pop out and land where? On sterile dirt? It wouldn't live. So with abiogenesis, it's just no possible life.
Right. Now, in verse 2, we have a very interesting statement. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. As you know, in the beginning, God is the Hebrew term Elohim. Elohim is a plural. Plurals, interestingly, in English we have the option of singular or plural, but in Hebrew you have the option of a dual as well. But this isn't a dual, it's a plural, giving room for the later New Testament doctrine of the Trinity. Now, many commentators are apoplectic when you try to bring the Trinity in here. They say, this is way too early in the Bible. Well, we say it is too early for the full exposition of it, but certainly this is a seed of it. It is also a way in Hebrew of expressing majesty and greatness. Interestingly, that plural word, which we might even crudely translate gods, doesn't mean there's 3 gods. It's used for the singular one God. The verb that follows is singular. So this God, 3 in 1, creates. Then we're introduced, for those who don't see the Trinity in this chapter, they're in big trouble by the second verse, because we have the Spirit of God superintending, hovering, caring for, nurturing what God has made. God is above and beyond. He's transcendent. But when God creates, he comes into and is involved with his creation. I believe the Son of God will also be involved in this creation. He's the one calling it into being. But specifically, we have the Spirit. Any comment on the second person mentioned in verse 2?
David, that word hovering, if I caught you right, you said it has the idea of care and nurture. It's not the Spirit of God is floating over the water looking at what to do.
No.
Rather, he is just like a mother hen flutters over her chicks with care and nurtures the idea.
Right. Yes, in Deuteronomy in the 30s somewhere, I forget the reference exactly, we have God himself seen as the eagle fluttering over her nest and caring for her young. That's the same verb. So it's actually a female image of a hen or a bird who cares for something that has just been hatched. And so God cares about his universe. He's involved with his universe. He is not a deist who sets it into motion and detaches himself from it, but he's what we call immanent in it. And if the Spirit of God is there at the beginning, so is the Son of God, because the next expression is, let there be light. Now, I'll ask a question here, since I've been doing an inordinate amount of talking. If it says, let there be light in verse 3, but the sun, moon, and stars are not created until the third day, make that the fourth day, There are two answers to that. First of all, therefore you have a gap. You can't have, well, wait a minute. We're just going to take the straightforward reading. How can you have light and a day with a morning and an evening in this first day when you don't have a sun, moon, or stars until the fourth day? Any help on that? Let me rephrase the question. If Genesis 1:1 is teaching that the earth was created before the sun, moon, and stars, what do we learn from that? I will give further clues if necessary. Well, I'll tell you what I think. All right. First of all, the earth is a tiny little planet in a kind of nondescript solar system, in a kind of mediocre galaxy, and that's the way scientists see it. That's not the way God sees it. The earth is the theater of the universe. This is the little place, the little green spot, where God would send his Son. This is the place where redemption's drama would be carried out. This is the place God will recreate, and where the New Jerusalem will provide an interface between heaven and earth. This is the place of moment and importance. So even though it will be set in motion around the sun, and the sun will be part of a galaxy, and the galaxy will be one of millions, if not billions, floating around in a giant space God has made, this is a geocentric chapter. Notice what I'm saying. Not geocentric in the Copernican sense. The earth is not the center of our universe. It revolves around the sun. We're not questioning that. The Bible teaches that. But what we're saying is that theologically, the earth gets the place of prominence or preeminence. We'll use both words in this chapter.
Isn't this against, again, the Egyptian mythology that would have worshipped the sun and the moon and the stars? Mm-hmm. And he's really putting them in their place, isn't he? That they're secondary. God is the source of all living things.
David, do you think that when it says in verse 3, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good? That's a pretty unique statement. He doesn't make a general statement of all that he created that day was good. But in particular, he sort of highlights light as being good. And I think you see, again, a seed of spiritual truth here. Yes. That in physical creation, God wants us to learn deeper spiritual truths. For example, light is a theme. For example, in 2 Corinthians 4, God who commanded, in fact, that quotation, let there be light, has caused the light of the gospel to shine into dark hearts. So it almost looks like God wants us to look at creation and learn deeper truths about him, and moral and spiritual truths.
That's a great place in 2 Corinthians 4 you're quoting from. God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined in our hearts. And the purpose of that is that we might perceive the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So we understand that above all things, the light speaks of Christ, who is the light of the world. It's interesting to answer my own question about how can you have light without sun, moon, and stars yet? It's exactly the same situation you'll have at the end. In the New Jerusalem, there will be no sun, there will be no moon. The Lamb is the light thereof. And I believe that this is probably the best explanation. I believe just as the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, that the Son of God, as light, uncreated light, enters into the universe and sends light diffusely throughout everything that he has made. Light speaks of divine wisdom. Light speaks of divine holiness. Light is what distinguishes what is dark and inferior from what is light and superior. Light is righteousness. Light is life. It gives life. All of those things the Son of God is.
And it's kind of interesting. That's why he says it is good.
It is
good.
good.
In fact, he said, I am the light of the world.
Yeah.
And God is light, and him is no darkness at all. So all those truths come out.
All you need for a day is a planet that spins on its axis and a fixed light source. You can have morning, you can have evening, you can have a day. The straightforward reading of Genesis would imply that, I don't think more than implies, it states that the light was there before the sun was there. So the sun becomes a fixed source of light for the earth in God's purposes on day 4. But I suggest, and I guess the gap theorists read between the lines, I can do that too. Right? We have to make some inferences to try to understand these things, understanding that they are only inferences. I believe the Son of God was the light source.
Hebrews is called the brightness of his glory.
Right, yeah.
And you have to realize that light is not tied to the sun, right? The sun is nothing more than a big candle, so it's a light source for us.
Right.
So there's no problem with light being created without the sun, because the sun is the source. So I agree with you that he is the source. The harder question for me that no one ever brings up is how do you divide the light from the darkness? Because the definition of darkness is there's no light. The definition of light, there is no darkness. So that's a deeper question, which no one, I don't even want to get into it, but no one, scientifically, it's a hard question, right? You can't have some light and some darkness. There's either light or darkness. There's not both. Like, so so that's a harder question we don't talk about. It's difficult to talk about. So
Although,
I would say he's the source of the light. The division of light from darkness.
Light is not absence of darkness. Light is created.
light is created.
It has substance. Darkness is not. Where there is no light,
Right.
there is darkness. But the converse is true only because light is real. I think that's an important distinction.
Light is the presence of something.
Yes.
Just as righteousness is the presence of something.
Correct.
People say, did God create evil? Wait a minute. Evil's not a substance.
That's right.
Evil is a deviation. It is a departure from righteousness. Therefore, it is a diminution of light. It is the loss of light. It is the rejection of light. But evil is not something that you create. It's like darkness, metaphorically, in this sense. It is the nothingness that is now filled with something, which is light. As we know that the Jewish people begin their day and evening not in the morning. So the Sabbath begins at sundown, right? And every other day as well. And that comes out of Genesis 1. The evening and the morning were the first day. We would say the morning and the evening. No, it's the evening and the morning. That reflects the order of God's working here. He begins with darkness. He ends with light. He begins with emptiness. He ends with filling. And his purposes are brought from nothing to something. And so that's the way the Jewish mind conceives of the day.
If I can return to that creative impulse of God in the beginning. I have a colleague, brother in the Lord. We have a little bit of argumentation on this in terms, and it relates to how about Trinity. He insists that it was our Lord Jesus Christ that created all things and nothing not created. And of course Colossians 1 attests to that. Thank you. And of course in the beginning in Genesis we have God. And there is even a verse in Job, Job 26:13. By his spirit he had garnished the heavens. His hand had formed the crooked serpent. And I'm wondering, I'm seeking some guidance from you. I have some thoughts on it myself in terms of that creation. That it's my judgment that Scripture should be integrated, and that it is God, and it is the Son, and it is the Spirit, the three divine persons that act in collaboration with one another, and that is the central force of this creation. But I haven't been able to convince
Your friend.
my colleague, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, certainly all three members, as we call them, of the Trinity were involved in creation. We have a hint of it here in the word, of course, God, which is a plural word, as I said, but when it's used by itself, absolutely, normally, it can be specifically referring to the Father, because for example, Isaiah 42:1, with the Son, with the servant and the Spirit, we have, of course, God there, meaning the Father, and we see the Trinity in that verse. So if the Father is the main emphasis of Elohim, and the Spirit is mentioned, then we have the Son as the light. I think we can see all three members of the Godhead working in concert. The Father initiating, the Son executing, the Spirit maintaining and supporting. Those seem to be the roles. Would you have any thought on that, either David or Andrew? Now, it appears that the Bible reading is wildly out of control, but it's not, actually, because I wanted to spend most of the time at the beginning, and we will be proceeding with the subsequent days, but I really think that the first few verses are the most important, not only because they're controversial, but because here's where all the basics are established. Now, in the outline, I have time, action, space, matter, and force on verse 1. And then what I tried to do, a bit laboriously, I admit, and it's really not for the purposes of breaking down every entry, but I noticed that there was speaking, evaluating, separating, naming, reviewing, or some combination of those in every one of the days. It all began with God's voice, let there be. Then whatever God commanded to be, became. It was so. Then God evaluates it. And for most of the days anyway, most of the time, he'll isolate something that is good, or as he looks over the entire week, very good. Then God, at least at the beginning, in the first 3 days especially, is separating. We've already mentioned that. God also takes ownership and responsibility for what he has made by naming it. To name something is to control it and to be Lord over it in Old Testament terms. So God renames people when he takes further control of their lives, such as Abraham coming from Abram, or Jacob becoming Israel. Sorry, I'm pulling those out of the air. So naming is very important. So as we move through, we want to identify those things. Now, if anyone wants to take a break now and use the restroom or something like that, what we're going to do is stand up and sing a hymn. But we're not going to take the 15-minute break. I'm so sorry. But I have mismanaged the time that way. So I'd like to have about half an hour to conclude what I want to get out of the remainder of the chapter. So what we're going to do now is take a break in the sense of singing a hymn together. And if you want to stretch or go out and use the restroom or get a drink, please feel free to do so. We're going to sing number 396, please. 396, immortal, invisible God, only wise, in light inexpressible, hid from our eyes. Most blessed, most glorious, the Ancient of Days, almighty, victorious, thy great name we praise. Let's stand at 196. And I think we'll now proceed to notice the things I mentioned, the naming, the speaking and the existing of things based on God's powerful word, God's assessment and so forth in the subsequent days. God says, on verse number 6, let there be a firmament or an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, so the evening and the morning were the second day. This is a description of the division of a pre-existent material. That is, the waters, which were one, are now separated into a lower and an upper compartment. The expanse is what we call sky, or the heavens. The waters below are the waters that are on the surface of the planet and under the surface of the planet. The waters above, I think most would agree with me, there may be some disagreement, are actually a canopy of water above that was around the earth. And 2 Peter refers to this and tells us that just as the inherent ability God had to judge the earth in the flood by bringing down those waters through the windows of heaven, as they're called, so the final judgment of the earth is built into the atomic structure. And so God at that time will cause the elements to melt with fervent heat. Here we have waters separated above and below. Now some people will say, well, vapor canopies, can't we just have this be the clouds? Well, you have a difficulty with that because, for one thing, we find that rain did not occur on the earth before the flood. So we have a very, very different topography, a very, very different atmosphere. We have a presumably tropical atmosphere throughout the earth. We all know that we can find tropical plants in fossil forms in Siberia, in the Terra del Fuego, and places like that that are clearly way outside even the temperate zone, never mind the tropical zone. So it was a very different Earth. Some have speculated as well that the long ages of people, and this is speculation, were not only because they had relatively recently come from the hand of God and didn't have all the genetic burdens that we carry today through the passage of time, but that they were protected from ionizing radiation because of this vapor canopy. That's a surmise, but it's an interesting one. Anyway, we again see God separating. He separated the light from the darkness. Now he's separating waters above and waters below. Any comment on this second day? And maybe it's a spiritual meaning as well.
I was going to ask the question. This is a little bit off of the topic. Any thoughts on what the days are? Are they? I know we haven't talked about it. Literal 24-hour days, or could they be long periods of time?
Well, you know, I was trying to become an old Earth creationist at one point in my life, but I failed in the attempt. I could not get away from the basic hermeneutical principles that we follow of interpretation. I could not mythologize Genesis 1. I could not turn it into poetry. I had to accept it for what it is. Any person, remember, the Bible's not made for academics who work in institutions. The Bible's made for the common man. Any normal person reading this is going to see a 24-hour day with the morning and skip correct order, evening and the morning being day 1, evening and the morning being day 2. In fact, if you look throughout the Hebrew Bible, every time there is a numerical adjective associated with yom, the word day, it means a 24-hour day. People say, yes, but what about the seventh day? It says, in the day that God created, in Genesis 2, verse 3. Verse 2. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done and rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. I'm actually not referring to the right verse. Let me skip that one. I'll come back to that later when I remember it. Okay? Let's go back to the basics here. The point I was going to make is that expression, in the day, that occurs, which means clearly in the era, is a Hebrew, verse 4, thank you, it comes into the next section, is a Hebrew expression which means when. It's an idiom that simply means when. It is not a precise parallel to the use of the word day in Genesis 1. Now we know in Exodus 20, God says, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. Therefore, our work week is modeled after God's work week. What value is there in making ages out of these days when they are designed to teach us about the 24-hour day in which we work? There are other arguments as well. Do you have any additional thoughts on that, David or Andrew?
Well, if you can show that that's not scriptural, that's very helpful. Because if Adam was made on day 6, and he was, and he lived through part of day 6 or all of it, and then he lived on all of day 7, and these days are long periods of time, how old was Adam? Well, when you come to Genesis 5, it says when he had Seth, he was 130. So I think you can show, even from that standpoint, that it won't do justice to say. And you can't say, well, maybe the first 5 days were longer than maybe days 6 and 7 were shorter. You get into those sorts of scriptural conundrums that you can't explain. Sorry for taking you away from...
No, that's okay. That's a very important point, so it should have been discussed at some point. It turns out, too, that if you try to make these days into long ages, you get into massive troubles. For example, you have the plants formed on day number 3, but the insects don't come along until day number 5. Make that day number 6, okay? So how can you have pollinating plants that require insects and insects that require pollen? Clearly, they have to be created together in order for that system to work. It will work if they're 3 days apart. It won't work if they're 3 billion years apart, okay? You have life beginning on the land in day number 3. Science says it begins in the sea. It turns that upside down. You have many things that simply will not work with some sort of day-age theory. So as nice as it has been to think about, we have to dismiss it in the end. Now, this separation of the light of the waters above and the waters below was simply a reforming of what God had already made. Some people say, why does it say, why is there no assessment on the second day? Where am I here on my outline? Day 2. Where God looks at something and evaluates it and blesses it. Because I think, primarily, he is only separating what he has already made. So there's nothing new here that is being called good. Then God said, verse 9, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, we're still on the same day, so there's 2 parts to this day. The third day has 2 parts. Very important in parallel, because we'll find the 6th day also has 2 parts. The second part wasn't just the creation of the dry land, but to populate it with plants. Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, which seed is in itself on the earth. And it was so. So the earth brings this forth. God calls it good, and there's evening and morning the 3rd day. This brings to a conclusion the forming of the earth. We talked about tohu vabohu, without form and void, meaning what? Unformed and unfilled. We're now done with the formation. We have had the light, we have had the water separated, we've had the dry land appear, and we've had plants appear on the dry land. There's a very important point from this. Plants are not regarded as life in the Bible. People say, well, before Adam sinned, there was no death. What about the death of plants? No, the Bible never talks about plants as being living. They're biologically alive, cellularly alive, but the definition of life in the Bible is the soul of life. Nephesh, the soul of life. And specifically, the life of the flesh is in the blood. So the plants are not part of the filling. They're part of the forming. The plants are like carpet, okay? They're not the chairs. The plants are the basic element that all of animal life will feed on. That is not construed as death by the Bible. They are not living things in the sense of nefesh chaya, which in Hebrew means the soul of life. That's a very important point. So that it concludes the forming of the earth. Any comments about the 3rd day and why it's set up this way?
Is that the reason why we don't have a blessing of God on the 3rd day? Sorry, let me see here.
Actually, we do at the end of the second part. There's 2 parts, and the question is, do they apply to both parts? That would be, God saw that it was good, verse 12, so the evening and the morning were the 3rd day.
I have a question. If the waters had to be separated from land to appear, and when the flood came, all that water that had to be moved apart for land to come up, and then all the other water that dropped on the earth, where did all it go?
Where did it all go afterwards? I don't think there's probably any other answer than it's part of the current seas and perhaps subterranean waters as well today. If you had rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, you would not have water over the tops of anything, pretty much, right? So we all know that the water that was involved in the judgment at the flood was not rain per se, although there was rain, but it was the fountains of the great deep being broken up and the windows of heaven being opened. So subterranean waters came up, and the vapor canopy came down. And that deluge produced a massive amount of water that really almost went back to day number 2, before God had, day number 3, before God had separated the land from the waters. After the flood dissipated, God caused the dry land to appear again, and all the waters would be contained in the seas. I don't see any other answer than that. Do you have any thought? Okay.
In that Isaiah 45 passage again, where it says, God created it to be inhabited, was a necessary statement, because if they looked at the face of the globe in Isaiah's day and we look at it today, why is so much of it uninhabitable? In fact, at the end of our chapter, when God says in verse 29, behold, I've given you every herb bearing seed. He says, which is upon the face of all the earth. The implication is that the majority of the earth was covered with vegetation. Something happened. 70% of the face of the earth is water. Of the remaining 30%, about 10% of that is actually habitable when you take out the polar regions and you take out the deserts and you take out tundra. So a very small percentage of the earth is habitable. And that argues again what happened.
We'll now talk for the last few minutes about the filling of the earth. The first is the filling of the skies. Even though this is a geocentric perspective and we're seeing everything from Earth's point of view, God starts with himself or with the heavens and moves down to the earth. So we saw that with the let there be light in the heavens. And now we see it with the sky coming first. And so the sky, of course, refers not just to the atmospheric heavens, but to the second heavens, outer space. And so God says, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and for signs and seasons and days and years. Once again, an argument for the 24-hour day. What do seasons and years mean if days don't mean 24-hour intervals? They're meaningless. Let them be for lights in the heavens to give light on the earth. They're not to be worshipped. They are simply to be seen as servants. They are providing something that God originally made so that it will be perpetually provided to his planets and specifically to the earth. And it will be mainly for time distinction. And so days and nights and seasons, of course, we are used to that concept, and years would all be determined by planetary motion. Then, go ahead. No.
I was just going to add, it's significant in verse 16 that he doesn't refer to them, the two lights, as the sun and the moon, but he calls them the greater light and the lesser light. And to add to what Andrew's been emphasizing in the Bible reading about, the pagan deities, they were named and therefore they were worshipped by the pagans. But the Hebrews are getting, here's the original intention of these bodies that you see. They're lights. That's what they're for. And they're not to be for anything else.
Just to add one more thing to that, this is the point where the tension starts to build. He stops naming things at this point. Mm-hmm. So the tension starts to build. If you're reading this naturally, you think, okay, why did he stop naming things? He's building to the creation of man now, isn't he? Mm-hmm. Because when man comes, man is given that dominion and given the responsibility to name the different creatures at that point. So the tension is now going to build to the point where we understand this. I mean, Richard Dawkins can't get beyond this. I mean, how can he describe, how can he explain the distinction between us as human beings? I mean, it's pretty obvious. Or I had a friend in college who told me I'm no different than the squirrel out in the field. And I said, well, John, why are you sitting here? I mean, you're in college. It doesn't make any sense. I don't see squirrels going to college. And why would you bother? But the point is, right now, the distinction is starting to be made. The tension is starting to build to the point where man is responsible to observe creation and to actually have dominion over it.
So is there a point here about the rights of naming? In other words, certain things that God named, as you were saying, Andrew, and then God gave man a sort of jurisdiction of what to name. But maybe, as you're saying, David, the idea that man started to name things that God left alone, God named and said, this is what it's called, right, has led to some form of idolatry. So we start emphasizing, man sort of usurps what God has named and starts taking over that and results in actually falling.
Right.
I don't know if there's...
It's a good point. You were going to say something, Alan? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to, we don't have time to go through it, but this is an area where people also talk about the length of time it takes light to reach us from a star that's far away. David mentioned to me too, to mention that because they will talk to you about, scientists talk to you about, what about a star that's 15 million light years away? We're just seeing the light now. How did the light get there? How could it take that long? What's the answer? How could that be? I have a pretty simple answer. God put it there. And it didn't, they'll say, oh, you say God gave it the appearance of age. No, God didn't give it the appearance of age. God put the light there so you could see it. You're saying that light there looks like it's old because it would have taken a long time to get here if I measured this time. So you're putting the appearance of age on it. God just created the light. We put the appearance of age. We're looking at it and measuring it compared to our yardstick saying light moves this fast, therefore it must be been out there 15 billion years. God didn't make an appearance of age, he put a star out there. There's light from that star to us. Actually, we think, we just see a light. No one's actually been to that star. They see a light and say, it must come from the star. I believe it's from the star because the Bible says he put the stars there. So we give it the appearance of age, not God. God just put the light from here to there, which isn't hard for him to do. And I can't understand how he did it, even if I went to college. I won't.
Supernatural, though.
Supernatural, yeah. I mean, this is a creation after all, right? That's right. And the light was there before the sources of the light were created to make them a fixed source of that light for perpetuity, right? Yeah, right. Okay, we're going to speed a little bit here because we're going to talk about the next day, which is day 5, very briefly. Here's where we have God bringing life, but as Andrew has pointed out and others, not naming them yet, because that will be delegated to his man. But the birds of the heaven, and of course, we have the creatures that dwell in the sea. Notice the parallel with Genesis day 2. In Genesis day 2, God divided the waters from the waters and created the expanse called the heavens. He will now fill the waters and the heavens. Not the earth yet, that's the next day. But he's working in the framework now. On the second day parallels day number 5. Day number 1 and day number 4 were parallel. Day number 1, light. Day number 4, the sources of light. Now we have day number 2 corresponding to day number 5. Day number 2, the waters separated above and below. The sky appears. Now the waters and the sky will be filled. It's interesting, birds and fish have a lot in common. They school, they migrate, they move through a fluid medium that we are not able to move through. They have much in common with each other that land animals don't. But then we move on to the final day, and this is where we want to spend the last few minutes. God says, let the earth bring forth the living creatures in verse 24. God makes the beasts, the cattle. He pretty much talks about different kinds of animals. And he's now populating the dry land, which appeared on day number 3. So day number 6 and day number 3 are parallel. Day number 3, dry land appears. Day number 6, dry land gets filled. But this, like day number 3, which was divided into 2 pieces, is now going to be divided into 2 sections. The first section is going, and this will be very important theologically, because the first section is all the animals. The second section is man. Man is different. We find out how different he is in chapter 2. But even in this chapter, he's distinguished. This is the only time God deliberates with himself. Let us make man in our own image after our likeness. And so God creates men and women, but he creates one man, and from him, we learn in chapter 2, one woman. He wants them to have dominion. Part of that dominion is by naming. You name something, you claim it. You name something, you have dominion over it. You name something, you understand it. So when Adam was naming the cows, he didn't name one Blossom and one Clover, and or he didn't name his dog Fido. He wasn't just giving them tags or convenient names. He was perceiving God's purpose in creating them and identifying that with a proper label. Perception and ownership. He was taking dominion because God's purpose was to have a man. He'd have dominion over his entire creation. The man he had in mind was Christ. When Satan, and this is my view, I'll weigh in on this matter, perceived now, after the man had been made, that he was not to be the showpiece, that it was not Lucifer, but rather the man who was to rule and to reign, that God had a man in mind, not an anointed cherub who covers. I believe that's when he rebelled.
This, I'd like to ask this question. This in verse 26 says, "God, let us," who is us that make man? Who is he referring to?
Again, the plurality corresponds to the name Elohim, which is a plural form with a singular verb. It's one and it's three at the same time, which brings the mystery of the Trinity together. This was what we might call the council within the Godhead. I think one way to explain it. God is not talking to anyone but himself, I believe, right?
Brother, can you reiterate that juncture where Lucifer rebelled?
Okay, that's opinion, all right? That's opinion. I believe that at the end of this creation week, everything was pronounced very good. I believe Satan had been created, we know called Lucifer. I believe he was created on day 1 because he witnessed the rest of the creation being made. And I believe he was unfallen based on the condition that God pronounces his whole universe to be at the end of the seventh day, end of the sixth day, on the seventh day. I believe in chapter 2, God's designs for man and his design to put a man over all things was very clear to Satan. I believe by chapter 3, he had rebelled and desired now to bring the man down with him. That's just my opinion. That's how I see the flow. The image and likeness of God, we're going to have to talk about very briefly. This is only true of the man and, of course, of the woman as well. Image is God's representative. Likeness is God's resemblance. That's one way of thinking of it. Now, some people would say, oh, this is Hebrew parallelism. They mean exactly the same thing. Look, Hebrew parallelism means that the two are similar or can be compared to each other. It never means that they're necessarily identical. There would be no point in putting the second word in if there was no difference whatsoever. The difference may be subtle, and people have argued about what it is, but clearly the man was to be God's image and representative. But he was also made in a way that resembled God. He was made a moral creature. He was made a spiritual creature to be distinguished from the animal creation. Any thought about those expressions, the nature and the likeness of God? Or, excuse me, the image and the likeness of God.
So that does tell us that man has a spirit and a physical body. I mean, we are corporal and all spiritual, but primarily spiritual. And the order that God wants is that the spirit control the body, not vice versa, which is what we see in fallen men.
That's a great point. So I think specifically the spiritual element in man is being emphasized here, in that he has been made after the likeness of God. God is spirit. God is a person. God is moral, right? God is rational. God has spiritual qualities. Obviously, he is spirit. We have spiritual qualities. We're made after the similitude of God, James tells us. Now, I'm going to throw in something very maybe unusual here that not all of you may agree with, but I would like to say it anyway. It's very convenient at half hour because there's no chance for any rejoinder or retort. But animals have souls. They have the soul of life. Nefesh chaya. It's used again and again in this chapter. That's the value of animal sacrifice. The life of the flesh is in the blood. They're giving soul life on the altar in exchange for our lives. But animals, this is my opinion, nowhere in the Bible are ever said to have spirits. They are said to have breath, and the same Hebrew word is used for breath and spirit, so one can become confused. It talks about animals being drowned in the flood who had the breath of life, ruach. But that's not to say that they have a spirit entity as part of their ontology or makeup. So only man is made in the image and likeness of God. Man is different. Man is vastly more important than any animal life. Animal rights activists have completely lost this point. People who teach abortion, who teach euthanasia, who teach infanticide, all of this becoming more and more prevalent and accepted. People who don't understand the uniqueness of man, don't understand that when we kill a person, we are putting God to death in effigy. The image and likeness of God is being assaulted whenever a person is attacked or killed. We understand the importance of giving man his rightful place in the creation.
That relationship, the vertical relationship of image of God, automatically flows to the next relationship he gives, male and female. Mm-hmm. Vertical, horizontal. If we don't understand that we are all made in the image of God, we will not treat each other with equality. Mm-hmm. The two go together. And so when Francis Schaeffer brings out the fact when death occurred, when sin came in, 4 types of death occurred. And I think this is fascinating. He defines it in a very specific way, and it can only be this way for those who are distinctly the image of God. We die to God first. We're separated from God. Secondly, we die to ourselves. We lose our own identity. Thirdly, we die to each other. Our relationships are ruptured. And fourthly, we die physically by natural means. And so all 4 of those come into play. Our relationship with God is broken, but our relationship with each other. And the gospel brings them back, doesn't it? It brings both back. You can't have fellowship with God. John makes this clear. We can't have fellowship with God without fellowship with each other being restored as well. The two go together.
Very good.
We see actually that salvation is Godhead being one. That's the key to refining to our level.
Amen.
It means that we don't belong in that level.
That's it. Yes.
Let me summarize as we are 2 minutes past the time. We have taken on a vast subject. We've only touched the corners of it. Didn't quite get through the outline. And, of course, much more could have been said. But I hope we walk away with a few things. Number one, we can glorify God for his wisdom and majesty and power. Number two, we can understand that the Word of God makes sense. And that when we are talking about operational science, the Word of God and science agree, although we never put the Word of God subservient to what we understand science to say. When it comes to origin science and forensic science, it's based on the philosophy of man, which desires to put God out of his universe, and comes up with ideas and fanciful notions which are not supported by proper science, and can be rejected with impunity, without embarrassment, without apology, because our system, our model, as we understand it from the Bible, better explains, correlates, and predicts data in nature. And so that's a very important message to take. We can trust the Bible. The one part that we didn't talk about, which I think would be a troublesome digression, I won't talk about it now, but I'll invite discussion afterward. We'll have to form little groups of discussants afterwards. If indeed the gap theory is not true, it may be true, but concede for a moment it may not be true, then and death did not come until Adam sinned. There was no death in the Garden of Eden. There was no death of any animal that had the soul of life in it. By man came death, 1 Corinthians 15. As by one man sin entered the world and death by sin, Romans 5:12. Then how could the ecosystem work? When you have carnivores and herbivores, when you have limited resources, when you have animals reproducing at vast rates that require predation to control them. My simple answer, now that I raised the question, I have to ask you to give me 1 minute to answer it. I believe Genesis 1:29 and 30 clearly state that all animals were herbivorous. I believe what we do not understand is the ecosystem of the Garden of Eden, which was different, and that there was a clear-cut genetic change as part of the curse, as part of the bondage of corruption, Romans chapter 8, that altered significantly the very phenotype of the animals such that the serpent would now crawl on its belly. The plants would now produce thorns and thistles. The cattle are now cursed in some unspecified sense. So that animals would now begin to prey on each other. And the ecosystem would be as we understand it today. Long and short of it, don't assume that the conditions of today prevailed in the Garden of Eden. Don't underestimate the effect of the fall on what God had made. And I think that will be the answer to that, and we can talk more about that individually. Sorry for the 5-minute transgression. Let me make a couple of announcements. At the close of the meeting, we would ask a brother who closes this meeting to give thanks for the refreshment, or not more than refreshment, the full-fledged dinner we're going to have downstairs, which will be served buffet style. The next meeting will be at 2, so that's an hour and a half from now, and Andrew Robertson will speak about the authority of Scripture, and we'll gather together 5 or 10 minutes early to sing. So those are the marching orders for the next 2 hours. I now thank you all for listening so well and for your help, and would ask some brother to close the meeting in prayer. It's together, and I hope this is useful, and I hope it doesn't sound repetitious, but let's begin where we ended. From the apologist's point of view, the most important thing to get straight in your mind and to be able to answer to people is the truth of the resurrection. The resurrection is what this whole weekend is based on. And let me explain how that works. If you use historical evidences to make the resurrection of Christ not only plausible, but unassailable, undeniable, then anyone who is open-minded about it and who is willing to exercise faith will understand that this is a real historical event. Once you've established that, then you go from that to saying, well, who was the one who rose from the dead? It was Jesus Christ. And he staked all of his claims as to who he was and what his work accomplished on the very fact that on the third day he would rise again from the dead. And he did. Therefore, we go back logically, and this is a chain of command. This is a chain of custody almost that we're going to follow backwards now. And that'll show that everything that he claimed to be himself and all that he said about his work must also be true. Therefore, the resurrection proving that takes us to the next step, which is, what did he claim to be true? What did he say about his death? Would it really be a ransom for many? Would it be something that would slake God's wrath and take away our sin? Would he be the Savior of the world? Would he be the Son of Man who has come to seek and to save the lost? We say yes, yes, and yes. All those things must be true as well. Since he has shown that what he has said is true, then what else has he said besides describing his work in the way I've described? Well, he said a lot of things. Basically, he has said that the entire Scripture cannot be broken. Therefore, we know that from Genesis to Revelation, everything in the Bible must also be true. And, of course, that begins with the book of Genesis. And it includes the creation account that we read. And so the Word of God is verified, and the Genesis account is verified by the fact that Christ proved who he is by his resurrection from the dead. That's why it's so important in 1 Corinthians 15. But I now want to shift gears a little bit and read with you in 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll take one well-known verse, and then I'm going to give you some thoughts to think about. First Peter chapter 3 and verse 13, "And who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, and when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." This would be the most famous verse used by what we're going to call semi-rationalists to defend the idea of defending the Bible or to defend apologetics. Let me set this up this way. You say, well, I don't know what the laws of thermodynamics are. I don't know what P45 or P66 or P75 is. I've been told to mind my P's and Q's, but I don't know what P documents are. And I don't know any of this technical stuff that has been trotted out before me this weekend. Does that mean I can't give an answer? And the answer to that is no. You definitely can give an answer. In fact, you can give the scriptural answer to defend the reason for the hope that is in you without knowing any of that stuff. And you say, well, then why did we do this weekend? That's a very good question, actually. And I need to defend that, and yet I need to show the limitations of what we have done this weekend, particularly what I did yesterday when we went away from the Bible a bit and talked about a lot of information from science and technology. Is there a value in doing that? I think there is a value or we wouldn't have done it, but I'm going to suggest the value of that is quite limited. And I'm going to show that the giving an answer in 1 Peter chapter 3:15 is not those technical answers. It's something else. So I'm going to build this case for you. There are people who are rationalists. They are Christians. And they say, this is John Warwick Montgomery, for example. He'll say, every non-Christian position must be destroyed factually. And the truth claims of Christ must be established factually. And if we don't do that, it's an abrogation, or it's an abdication is the right word, an abdication of our responsibility as Christian apologists. Okay. Well, I'm sorry, but that excludes 99% of believers. Only William Lane Craig can do that. Only, Ken Ham can do that. But not me, because I don't know all that stuff. But that's not right. That's not right. Then there are some who we call semi-rationalists, and they're the people who say, well, you do need to know some of that stuff, because if you just go to people and say, look, I was an unbeliever, now I'm a believer, I was blind, but now I see, that won't work. That's not going to convince them. You're going to have at least some rational arguments to trot out and to work with them and finally intellectually turn them over to your side. I'm going to argue that that's not right either. That's not right either. The only thing you need is what the apostles used when they made their apologies. And again, I'm going to remind you the word apology doesn't mean I'm so sorry if I offended you. It means I have something true to tell you, and I'm going to dispel your wrong ideas by giving you God's truth, unapologetically. All right? We're very unapologetic in our apologetics. Now, what are the apologetics that are in the Bible? That's really what matters. So we're going to think about this. We look this word up, apologia. Logia is an answer. Apo means away or in return. So they say something, and we say a word in return. So we're retorting. That's what we're doing. We're giving an answer. Well, we start to think about this in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 22, Paul makes an apology to the Jews. In Acts chapter 24, he does so to Felix. In Acts chapter 25, he does it again. In Acts chapter 26, he does it formally again to Agrippa. And we ask ourselves, if the word apologia or apologelomai, the same verb and noun forms of this exist in each of those cases, those would be good places to go look to discover what Bible apologetics is all about. And I'm going to remind you, without going through the details due to time, what did Paul actually do? He told them about his conversion. He argued from the Scripture. He challenged them as to the identity of Jesus Christ. I am before you accountable for what I have said about the resurrection, for example. Now, I'm going to ask you something. Here you are. You're in high school, or you're in college, or you're at work, or maybe you're younger. Maybe you're in middle school. I was telling you last year, I had a friend in middle school that I found out 30 years later had gotten saved through my sharing the gospel with him on the playground. I think we were up the jungle gym somewhere when that happened. So this applies to the young people as well. Can you give your testimony? Can you tell what great things the Lord has done for you? Can you share scriptures with people? Can you give them Bible truth even when they don't want to talk about the Bible? Nevertheless, say things that the Bible says. Can you challenge them about, as we were hearing from Brother David here, and this man on the plane, about their need, their guilt? What are they doing about their guilt? Do they not recognize that something's bent and broken in them? Those kinds of simple things are Bible apologetics. No thermodynamics, no P75, right? You don't need to know all that stuff to be a very effective apologist. In fact, I would say that all of those things are going to be useless at the primary level for an unbeliever. You say, once again, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. You're saying this whole weekend was a waste. No, I haven't said it's a waste. Let me set it up this way. What we have done this weekend is really for the believer. That's you folks, not for the unbeliever. And why would we do it for the believer? Because we are trying to encourage each other in our faith. We are trying to understand the answers to these questions better. We're trying to use Scripture, and I hope we have been scriptural this weekend to show that this is what the Bible teaches, so that we are confident and we can move forward out of here without being embarrassed about origins, knowing that the data of operational science are on our side, and that the Ponzi scheme that's been foisted on the entire world in the West, not in the East, but in the West, is a giant house of cards that's going to come tumbling down. We don't have to be part of that. We can stand apart. I would say this, though. Those Christians who are over 40, say, probably remember a time when you could be a good Christian in the USA and fit right in. It was actually easy in a way. Now, people didn't want your religion shoved down their throat, but they were happy to be your neighbors. They pretty much agreed with you on most issues, and everything was cool. That's not true anymore. If you want to be a Christian in 2014, you are going to be labeled as an extremist. Your views are going to be stifled. You are going to face laws that will now prevent you or try to keep you in the years that lie ahead from saying the very things that you and your neighbors would have agreed on 30 years ago. You start preaching against homosexuality. You start talking about abortion and moral issues. And if this government is any sign of what's going to be happening in the future, we are going to be progressively marginalized and we are going to be persecuted. And you understand that this is the norm for Christianity, and I think it's coming in this country. And so we need to be very confident in what we believe in, unapologetic. And we might as well start practicing today for those times because they're around the corner. Don't be discouraged. This could be a great challenge. It could be a life-changing thing for us. It might be very invigorating for assembly testimony to be able to do what most people have through the years and to stand apart from culture. You do not need to know, at the end of the day, those kinds of things, though, to preach the gospel to the unbeliever. Apologetics are primarily for the believer, to give us confidence and strength and courage. Now, why don't they work for the unbeliever? Because the unbeliever is not a neutral party who is waiting for more information. As we mentioned with the resurrection, they have a doctrine against the resurrection. You say, I didn't think they were religious. They don't think they're religious, but they are. They have a very strong doctrine, and they're attached to it. It's that God can't exist because there's no supernatural. Now, this isn't true of all your neighbors. A lot of your neighbors are very happy to believe in a spirit being, but they don't know who he is. They don't know who his son is. There's no doctrinal content to it, but they might be open to maybe your views to a certain level. But at the end of the day, what's their problem? They hate God. There is none that seeketh after God. They are altogether become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Not only that, they have a second problem. The God of this world has blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ should shine unto them. So those are two problems you can't solve, and I can't solve. You say, well, then it's hopeless. It's not hopeless. Those are always God's problems, and he was always able to solve them. We never were. We just thought we were. Now we realize, no, our job is not to force conversions through argument and get people by the throat and destroy them through reason. As Joe was saying, we're not trying to win arguments, we're trying to win converts. Now, that doesn't mean there's never a use for apologetics. Let me just be clear and balanced in what I'm saying. Let's say a person does have a minor objection that you can clear away, but at the same time, that person is a seeker. That person is seeking after God. You say, I thought you just said no one seeks after God. Well, that's true. No one in his natural condition seeks after God. But one who starts to seek for God is one who is being worked on by the Holy Spirit. And that person is ripe for gospel truth. There's a developing interest. That person, as we think about I think, Joe, you talked in an email to me once about the resurrection of Lazarus. Christ did what only Christ can do. He raised him from the dead. But he had people deal with the grave clothes. Loose him and let him go. We can handle that part. We can't do the resurrection part. And so there's a sense in which we can loosen grave clothes and we can make things a little bit more acceptable to people when especially when they've been misinformed about something about the Bible. We can set them right and show them that the Bible makes sense by what it says. But they will only work in a person who is ready to hear the message. We can go to Luke chapter 16 to get a very clear view of this, because there we find that there was a rich man who was in hell. And he says to Abraham, send Lazarus that he might warn my brothers. I've got some brothers, and they're living the same kind of reckless life that I did, and I don't want them to come to this place. And what does Abraham say? They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. He says, no, you don't understand the family I come from. We don't believe the Bible. We don't believe in old documents like that are obsolete. We believe in rationality. We're scientists. And we have to have empirical proof brought before us before we make big decisions. And I'm afraid that's not the answer he was looking for, but the correct answer, and the only answer that could ever keep his brothers out of hell, is if they heeded Moses and the prophets. In other words, God's word. So you come to a person and you say, well, I am a Bible-believing Christian and I'm going to heaven and I know that Christ died for me because his word says so. And they say, I don't believe the Bible. You say, why not? And they say, well, Jonah and the whale. Jonah and the whale. That's crazy. That could never happen. Now, what's your next move in this conversation, assuming they want to keep the conversation going? Well, we could take the apologetics approach. We could go to the Princeton Theological Journal of 1927, the October edition, and we could prove to them that a man named James Bartley off the Falkland Islands in 1891 was swallowed by a sperm whale. And 2 days later, he was rescued by a fishing trawler. That is true. Do you think that would solve that person's problem? No. So you didn't have to subscribe to the Princeton Theological Journal after all to be a good apologist. You simply say, well, you know, in my life, I have come to depend on the Bible because, and you give your reasons. Christ has changed my life. His resurrection shows that the truth of what he says must be believed because it is the greatest event in history and it's attested better than any event in the ancient world or the modern. And for that reason, I'm resting my eternity on him, and he's made all the difference in my life. I'm a new creation. My interests are different. I'm bound for heaven. I have a hope. And that's got to ring true to some folks who are thirsty for such things. That's the approach. So, we find that in Acts, the apology of the Apostle Paul is his testimony, the truth of the gospel, and statements from the Bible. That's accessible to all of us. And so I want to encourage you with that. Now, it is true that in Philippians, Paul uses the word, he talks about the defense and confirmation of the gospel. And here I suggest he's getting into more of an argument where there has been a disagreement, and we need to bring truth to bear on that disagreement so that we can come to the proper understanding. But I'm still going to say that that proof that is brought forward is going to be scriptural proof. It's not going to be from the apologetics library that gives you the opinions of men. It's not going to be from the flood geology model. It's going to be from clear statements in the Bible that have their own inherent power to change people. So, let me show you why 1 Peter 3, which is our text, supports what I've said. 1 Peter 3 talks about pure, reverent conduct. You say, we didn't read that part. Well, I'm backing up to the beginning of the chapter. I've just plucked these phrases out. Pure, reverent conduct. A gentle, tranquil spirit, treating others with consideration, harmonious and sympathetic and affectionate temperaments, compassionate people, humble people, people who bless others. Now, I ask you, for all those wonderful things that we are told to be as Christians, what does that have to do with argument? And the answer is, it has everything to do with argument. Because the apology that 1 Peter 3:15 is talking about is not scientific arguments. It is the quality of a converted life. It is the righteousness in your life that attracts others to you. They're the ones who come and say, what makes you tick? I want what you have. Why do you have hope? Why are you happy when you've had this happen to you? And you say, well, I've never had anybody ask me that. And I'm saying, okay, something wrong with this picture. You probably should have had somebody ask you that. And one of my challenges is today that we need to be sure that we're all of these things. We can only do this sort of apology with a clear conscience. When you're talking about debate, who cares about conscience? Who cares about being nice? You're more effective if you're mean. If you're ruthless, if you go for the jugular and riddle the person full of holes with your Tommy gun. That's what you do in debate. But that's not Christian apologetics. Christian apologetics is a righteous life and a kind, compassionate temperament, helping and blessing others that leads them to say, I want what you have. And when you get that question, you don't give them back apologetic answers in the rational sense. You give them back your experience, and you give them back the Scripture. That's what you give them. That's the only thing that works. I'm going to use an illustration of this that I got from John Whitcomb, who's a very influential writer in my life in my early days. John Whitcomb was a World War II vet. He was in the 109th Artillery Brigade in the U.S. Army. This is at the Battle of the Ardennes in Belgium, also called the Battle of the Bulge. They had some 60 105 millimeter howitzers. And, of course, the German tanks were coming their way. And the way they would do this is they would send forward observers right into the enemy territory. These were they were scouts, usually lieutenants, and they were responsible for staying hidden. They would get into the top of a house, they would be in a tree, and they would look for the advancement of the enemy. John Whitcomb's job was a radio man, so he was in a house usually, but behind the line. And then behind him were the 105 millimeter howitzers, okay? Now, we're going to talk about the Christian as the forward observer. You're out there on the front line. You're beyond the front line. You're in enemy territory. You've got people who are against you. You've got the God of this world controlling that territory. Because those people are against you and because the God of this world has it in for you as well, you're pretty hopeless and helpless, it would seem, out there in no man's land. Now, this verse says, sanctify the Lord God in your heart. What does that mean? It means to understand, first of all, that if you're going to win this war, you need to acknowledge Christ's lordship and ask for his help. It means that your loyalty to him is more important than your loyalty to people around you, and that you fear offending him more than you fear offending other people by what you say, because the cross is offensive. The Lord is the main one, and he's the one you have set apart in your heart. Now back to my illustration. We see a line of armor coming. Maybe some Panzer Vs, Panzer IVs, Tiger Is. These are formidable tanks. Okay, what's the forward observer going to do? He's got three options. He can come out from cover and run toward the tanks with his pistol and try to defeat the enemy himself. That will be disastrous. All the communication to the back will be lost. The column will proceed, and it will wipe out the entire line. Or he can panic, and he can say, this is no good. I'm not able for this. I'm not equipped for this. I went to an apologetics weekend in Boston, and they told me all these things. I don't remember them all. So I can't do this. So I'm out of here. So we might run. And, of course, that's going to be equally disastrous. The only way this is going to work is if he sanctifies those 105 millimeter howitzers in his heart. He knows that his job is to radio back and let them do the work. And as soon as the first shells come, they're smoke shells, they are for the purposes of ranging. And once they are in the proper range, then they put in armor-piercing shells, and they're able to stop those monsters from coming and defeating our side in the Battle of the Bulge. That's a very good analogy with what the Christian is doing on the front line. We are responsible to be out there. We need to let people know who we are as Christians. We need to have a very good testimony with people. Maybe that's where I'm going to end with, because that's where our problem is. We're not getting these questions. No one asks me for the hope that is in me. They don't think I have hope because I'm like them. Is it possible? But the minute they start asking, I realize that I'm not to walk away and abdicate my responsibility. I'm here for a reason. I'm not to try to convince this person with my own power. It won't work. This person has a heart of stone. This person is controlled by the god of this world. He's cradled in the devil's arms. I'm not able for that. But what can I do? I can sanctify the Lord God in my heart, and I can bring the power, armor-piercing power of the Word of God. The Word of God is living and powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, able to pierce asunder, right? To separate the inward areas that I have no access to, and to work powerful salvation in people and give them life. That's what works. I'm only there to bring it into their lives. So we asked the question at the end of the meeting, what should we have gotten out of this weekend? I want you to understand that the Bible speaks about origins. It speaks with authority. The one who was there and was not only the eyewitness, but the one who actually did the work is giving us his infallible version of what happened. That is the best you can get in epistemology. That is the understanding of what is true, or the acquisition of knowledge. It doesn't get any better than that. Everything else that people have to say about origins is way subsidiary to that, because now we're talking about fallible people with strong biases who weren't there. That's not so good. But the infallible word of the Holy God who was there, that's good. So we need to understand that even though maybe some Christians have gotten themselves in trouble by not understanding the difference between microevolution and macroevolution and saying all evolution is false, and we saw the falsity of that. You've got to get by that sort of thing and have a basic understanding of that difference. But that's about all you need to know. To say that all things came from nothing, I don't believe it. Don't be ashamed to say that. When it comes to God's Word, I've been spending some time on that. This is the only ammunition that works in apologetics, because it's powerful. Spurgeon said, why are you bothering, I'm paraphrasing, I know David would be appalled maybe at my abusive Spurgeon quotes, but why are you bothering to defend the Bible? Let the lion out of its cage, it'll look after itself, right? That's a good Spurgeon quote, sort of. All right, let the lion, it's very true. This is not words, this is God's Word. And it has its own inherent power and its ability to look after itself. If people are exposed to it, it will change them. Let's say you've got this person in the deepest recesses of a cave, And it's dark in there, and you go in there and you've got a flashlight in your pocket. And the person says, we'll never get out of here. This is dark. There's no way out. You say, there is. I have a light. And the person says, well, I don't think your light works. You say, well, no, it does work. I just put batteries in it yesterday. It's got an LED bulb, and it's very bright, and it could get us out of here. And you could go on and on arguing about whether this flashlight works or doesn't work, or you could do what's really the sanest thing to do. Turn it on. Okay? All argument ceases. Do you know that when God's word comes into people's minds, even if they're set against it, they have a receptor in their minds put there by God himself, and although they may fight tooth and nail against it, they recognize it as true. Your work isn't as hard as you thought it was. You bring the word to them, and let the word do the rest of the work. But to end here, and I'm 1 minute over, and I won't go as much over, I'm shutting this book, shutting this one, putting these notes away. But I want to say one thing. None of this works if we do not have a testimony with the world. None of this works if we are not seen to be righteous, honest, hard-working, caring, giving people. None of this works if we're not like Christ. We are his representatives. We are his mouthpieces in this world. He has sent us into the world. We need to be like him. You say, I'm not like him. I'm not either. But can we walk away from this weekend determined that we're going to change? That we're going to recognize that a reputation is something that takes years to build. Very unfairly, it takes seconds to lose, but years to build. That's why it's so important for Christians to develop discipline in their lives. And not to try to be isolated from others, but to use the gifts of other believers and the company of other Christians to keep you sanctified. And more importantly than that, to be immersed in this word that we have been talking about this weekend. In his law doth he meditate day and night. There's no substitute for this. Thy word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against thee. The more of this you memorize, the more when temptation comes, you're going to have a Bible verse pop into your head that's going to tell you what to do. Ignorance of this book leads to sin. Ignorance of this book leads to worldliness. Ignorance of this book leads to no testimony and no one asking you a reason for the hope that's in you. Those are the realities, okay? So be encouraged. Be a creationist. Be a biblicist. Be a Christ-like follower, a disciple. Go out there. Take on the day. No, that would be Dr. Laura. I would say, go on and take on the world, recognizing, though, that you need to sanctify the Lord in your hearts. And his word will do the work. Now, I'm going to appreciate your attendance and your attention, by the way. I'm going to close the meeting in prayer and give thanks for the food. And let me say on behalf of myself and Andrew and David how much we appreciated being here, as always. You're so generous and gracious to us. Such a good audience, and we're so glad to see so many folks of different age groups interested in what's being said today. So let's pray. Our Father, we thank thee for the Lord Jesus, and we thank thee this weekend has been about him, his work as creator, his work as the Word in bringing God's truth, his work as the Savior. We thank thee as the substitute for our sins, and the one who rose victoriously from the dead is at thy right hand, intimately involved with all of our lives, working for us. We thank thee God is for us, and who can be against us? We thank thee that we have the encouragement to know that the Word of God, the infallible Scriptures, are the guide that we need to help in every aspect of life. And we've been thinking especially of our witness in the world. We pray that thou will help us to redouble our interest and effort in influencing those around us so that they might ask us for a reason of the hope that is within us. Now we pray for every need in this meeting. We commit every person, anyone discouraged, anyone doubting, anyone who needs to hear a word of reproof. We thank thee that thy word is able to equip us for everything we need as men of God, women of God. We pray we may walk away changed from this weekend. We thank thee for the Assembly in Saugus, for their faithfulness in keeping these meetings twice a year, conference meetings for the benefit of local assemblies around as well as themselves. We pray for them, and we pray for the testimony here. We thank thee for their generosity in feeding us here and giving us hospitality. We thank thee, though, that the food and really all the goodness of others to trace us back to the goodness of our God. Thou art a good and giving God. In Thee there is no shadow of turning. We thank Thee, Father, every good and perfect gift comes down from above. So we thank Thee for the dinner we're about to partake of. We commit the rest of the day's activities to Thee and ask Thy blessing on us as we separate in the name of the Lord Jesus. Now, before you all go down,